Hello there. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Before we begin, take a moment to turn down the lights. Set your volume to a gentle level, not too loud. Just enough to hear me like a quiet thought in the back of your mind. Now close your eyes, let your body rest. Let your thoughts slow down, and let's drift into the quiet past together. This is the very first story in our Sleepy History series. Tonight, we'll be exploring the history of the first astronomical observatories, slowly, calmly, and without any rush. If you find comfort in these stories, please consider giving this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more soft journeys into the forgotten corners of time. Now, let's begin. In the deep silence of ancient nights, long before telescopes or calendars or clocks, our ancestors looked up. They looked up not with technology, but with wonder. With bare eyes, quiet hearts, and patient minds. They saw the sky not as a void, but as a canvas, changing, cyclical, filled with mystery and meaning. Before there were cities, before there were empires, there were watchers of the sky. The first observatories were not domes of metal and glass, but sacred hills, open-air platforms, or stone circles carved into the earth. They were places not built for speed or power, but for stillness, for waiting, for noticing. In places like Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, long before the pyramids rose, standing stones were arranged with careful intention, marking the summer solstice and aligning with celestial events. These were not just stones, they were messages across time, silent records of a people learning to track the heavens. And in faraway Mesopotamia, in the lands that would one day be called Babylon, clay tablets began to preserve the movements of the moon, the paths of planets, and the rhythm of the stars. The ziggurats, those step towers that rose from the desert floor, became more than temples. They became high places from which the skies were studied, slowly, meticulously, with devotion. These early astronomers did not separate science from spirit. To them, the sky was divine order. The stars whispered secrets. The planets were gods in motion. Tracking the sky was not just for curiosity. It was for planting crops, guiding rituals, reading omens. In China, ancient records speak of guest stars that appeared and vanished. These were likely supernovae, gigantic cosmic events witnessed and recorded thousands of years ago. The royal astronomers held great importance because the heavens were thought to mirror the emperor's rule. If a comet appeared, it could mean change or unrest or warning. So they watched, night after night, season after season. And in the high Andes of Peru, the people of Chanquillo built a line of 13 towers along a ridge, an ancient solar observatory that marked the path of the sun across the year. As dawn broke, the sun would rise between different towers depending on the season, telling the people when to sow, when to harvest, when to celebrate, when to prepare. These towers did not shout. They whispered. They were part of the land, blending with stone and sky, designed not to impress, but to last. In all these places, a quiet pattern emerges. Humans noticing the rhythm of something bigger than themselves. Noticing the regularity of rising and setting, the return of Orion, the tilt of shadows. These early observatories, though varied in form, shared a common soul. They taught patience. They required presence. To observe the sky without lenses or machines meant you had to slow down, to sit with the stars night after night, to notice, to wait. And in that waiting, a deeper understanding began to form, not just of the universe, but of ourselves. For to chart the heavens is to find your place beneath them. To study the stars is, in a way, to study time. The passing of days, the cycling of seasons, the turning of years. All of it written silently in the sky. These ancient observatories, though often forgotten or crumbled or buried, remain some of humanity's most peaceful achievements. They are reminders that before we sought to conquer the world, we first tried to understand it. Not with speed, not with noise, but with stillness, with attention, with awe. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let the story wash over you, imagine standing in one of those places. No lights, no clocks, just the quiet earth beneath your feet and the endless stars above. Imagine what they saw, imagine what they felt. That ancient rhythm is still with us now. As centuries passed and civilizations flourished, the sky remained a steady presence above it all, unchanged, unmoved, patiently circling while empires rose and fell. The simple stone markers of the past gradually gave way to more elaborate structures, but the heart of the observatory stayed the same, a place for watching, for learning, for connecting with the cosmos. In ancient India, scholars gathered in temples not only to worship, but to chart the movements of the stars and planets. Their knowledge was woven into the Vedas, sacred texts that spoke of celestial cycles, eclipses, and planetary alignments with both reverence and precision. Observatories like those later found in Ujjain and Jaipur weren't just collections of instruments. They were giant sundials, shadow casters, and horizon measurers, built from stone but fueled by questions that were eternal. These structures, with their sweeping arcs and towering gnomons, whispered quietly to the sun, the moon, and the stars, asking what time it was, not by clocks, but by light and shadow. And far to the west, in the heart of the Islamic Golden Age, cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Samarkand became beacons of astronomical knowledge. Here, under the calming glow of oil lamps and the careful turning of pages, scholars preserved Greek astronomy and expanded upon it with brilliance and care. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was more than a library. It was a sanctuary for those who sought to understand the heavens. Al-Battani refined the measurement of the solar year, Al-Zarqali crafted detailed astronomical tables, and Al-Tusi constructed the Maragay Observatory in Persia, a sophisticated center that combined observation with theory and tradition with discovery. These scholars studied not only for faith, but for truth. They believed the universe was orderly, and that understanding its rhythm could bring one closer to the divine. They built instruments like the astrolabe, the quadrant, and the armillary sphere, not machines of noise and force, but of elegance and silence. Instruments that turned the sky into a map, a clock, a compass. Meanwhile, in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the Maya civilization built observatories that were deeply tied to both science and ceremony. The city of Chichen Itza holds one of the most striking structures, El Caracol, or the snail, named for its spiral staircase. Its windows align with key points on the horizon, marking the setting and rising of Venus, a planet the Maya watched with immense attention. For them, Venus was not just a distant orb. It was a deity, a guide, a calendar in the sky. Their codices recorded eclipses, conjunctions, solstices with astonishing precision. Time for the Maya was sacred, and to measure it, they watched the stars. They built pyramids with steps that cast perfect shadows during equinoxes, turning the movement of the sun into a divine performance. These early observatories were not hidden in laboratories or locked behind doors. They were open, breathing, part of the world. They stood among trees and winds, mountains and rivers, silently watching the same sky we see today. And though their cultures have shifted, their stones still stand, quiet, waiting. The connection they built between earth and sky has not been broken. And in the great silence of the night, their questions still echo. How does the sky move? What does it mean? Where do we fit in this vast turning wheel of light? As we lie here, eyes closed, mind drifting, these questions do not demand answers. They ask only for our presence, to be still, to listen, to remember that long before we reached for the stars, we sat beneath them, watching, wondering, learning. The observatory, whether a carved stone, a towering ziggurat, or a domed building with brass instruments, has always been a temple of quiet curiosity, a reminder that the most powerful discoveries begin not with noise, but with noticing. And so tonight, we lie still beneath the same sky. Somewhere, perhaps, the stars are aligning just as they did for the Maya, the Persians, the Babylonians. Somewhere, the silent math of the universe continues its gentle rhythm, and though we may not understand it all, we can still feel it. That slow, eternal turning, that peaceful pulse above our heads, that quiet invitation to rest. As human civilizations moved into the Renaissance and beyond, the desire to understand the sky did not fade. It deepened, becoming more refined, more systematic, but never less wondrous. The observatory evolved, taking on new forms and functions, now combining physical structures with carefully designed instruments. And yet, at its core, it remained a place of stillness and gaze. In Denmark, under the patronage of King Frederick II, the brilliant astronomer Tycho Brahe constructed Uraniborg in the late 16th century, a magnificent island observatory that combined gardens, living quarters, and astronomical devices, all in one unified space. Uraniborg was more than a building. It was a statement of purpose, an echo of an age when observing the heavens was a noble endeavor, supported by kings and built with care. Brahe, with no telescopes available yet, relied on enormous armillary spheres and sighting instruments, and the data he recorded by hand, night after night, was so precise that later scientists would use it to reshape our understanding of the solar system. His assistant, a German mathematician named Johannes Kepler, would go on to use that very data to derive the laws of planetary motion, realizing, through quiet persistence, that planets did not orbit in perfect circles, but in ellipses. This revelation, so gentle yet so profound, marked a turning point in our relationship with the cosmos. In Italy, the name Galileo Galilei emerged, a figure whose very mention evokes curiosity, courage, and confrontation. Using a modest telescope, barely a meter long and crafted with his own hands, Galileo looked up and changed everything. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, rough textures on the moon's surface, and phases of Venus, clear evidence that not everything revolved around the Earth. His observations, made in the small observatories of Padua and Florence, were revolutionary, not for their volume, but for their clarity. For the first time, humanity had not just measured the stars, but truly seen them, magnified and real. The sky was no longer a fixed sphere. It was dynamic, textured, layered. Yet Galileo's insights came with a price. His telescope had opened new windows, but also new fears. He was summoned, tried, and silenced. And still his telescope remained, a quiet sentinel of truth, resting in wood and glass. Further north, in England, the Royal Observatory of Greenwich was established in 1675, its hilltop position overlooking the River Thames like a lighthouse of precision. Here, astronomers would work to perfect the measurement of time and location, eventually giving rise to the prime meridian, the invisible line that now marks the 0 point of longitude, dividing east from west. From Greenwich, observations were not just about stars and planets, but about creating systems, navigation, standard time, global maps. Yet even here, in the heart of empire and empire building, the observatory remained a place of patience, of quiet focus. Observers worked through fog and cold, writing down star positions, checking the movements of the moon, calibrating clocks. Their work would guide ships, travelers, and timekeepers around the world, even as most people never saw the stars themselves. Across the Atlantic, new observatories rose in the Americas. In places like Harvard, Allegheny, and later Mount Wilson and Palomar, massive telescopes stretched humanity's reach into deeper space. These instruments, cooled and calibrated, brought the nebulae, galaxies, and distant quasars into view. The sky, once observed from hills and towers, was now studied from mountaintops and high deserts. And still, it was the same sky, the same quiet dome, the same turning stars. What had changed was not the universe, but our ability to see more of it. And yet, with every new lens, every more distant star, a familiar feeling returned. The same awe that the people of Nabta Playa must have felt, standing by their stones. The same breathless wonder of the Maya, watching Venus rise. The same careful gaze of Tycho Brahe, sighting Mars from his island dome. We are still watchers, still learners, still small beneath the vast canopy. And even now, as satellites orbit above and machines listen in on radio waves from distant galaxies, the role of the observatory has not vanished. It has only changed shape. From stone circles to radio dishes, from open skies to dark domes, from bronze armillaries to digital sensors, every step has been a continuation of that first gaze upward, that quiet moment of wonder, that patient act of noticing. As you rest here tonight, let the history of the observatory remind you, not of machines or names or numbers, but of the gentle persistence of curiosity, of the quiet bravery it takes to sit with mystery, to ask the stars for their stories, and to wait for them to whisper back. As the 20th century unfolded, humanity's quiet conversation with the cosmos grew more ambitious, more far-reaching, but no less rooted in that ancient urge to look up and wonder. Observatories moved from hillsides and towers into remote deserts, mountain peaks, and eventually even beyond Earth itself. But despite the advances in mirrors, lenses, and electronics, the essence of an observatory remained the same, a bridge between the known and the infinite. In the clear, dry air of California, the Mount Wilson Observatory rose to prominence in the early 1900s, perched atop a ridge in the San Gabriel Mountains. Here, the giant Hooker telescope, at 100 inches in diameter, became the most powerful eye humanity had yet built. With it, astronomer Edwin Hubble would make a discovery that shook the foundations of science and philosophy alike. The universe was not static, it was expanding. Galaxies were not part of a single stable cosmos, but were moving away from us, each like a distant lantern carried by unseen winds. This revelation, born of silent nights spent tracking faint smudges of light across photographic plates, opened a new chapter in our cosmic story. And just as the stars had once guided farmers and emperors, now they guided physicists and dreamers, reminding us how small we are and how wide the mystery truly is. Further advancements came quickly. The Palomar Observatory, home to the 200-inch Hale telescope, extended our reach even deeper into the night. Meanwhile, radio telescopes began to emerge, great dish-like instruments that did not observe visible light, but rather the radio waves emitted by celestial bodies. In Arecibo, Puerto Rico, a vast radio dish was built inside a natural limestone sinkhole, becoming one of the most iconic observatories in the world. Its receivers listened to the whispers of pulsars, the murmur of galaxies, and even sent messages into deep space, a gentle, hopeful hello to whoever or whatever might be listening. Across the globe, observatories became symbols not only of knowledge, but of unity. Nations collaborated to build ever more powerful instruments, recognizing that the sky belonged to no one and to everyone. In Chile's Atacama Desert, where the air is bone dry and the nights endlessly clear, the European Southern Observatory constructed telescopes with astonishing precision. They sit high on mountaintops, far from city lights, waiting in silence for photons that may have traveled billions of years to arrive. To observe from such a place is to look backward through time itself, witnessing the universe not as it is now, but as it was long before we were born. In the Arctic and Antarctic, small observatories endure brutal winters for a chance to study cosmic phenomena with minimal atmospheric interference. Even in Earth's orbit, observatories like the Hubble Space Telescope circle quietly, far above weather, pollution, and distortion. Hubble's lenses have captured the birth of stars, the dance of galaxies, the remnants of cosmic explosions, all with a clarity that feels almost divine. Each image, each dataset, each revelation adds another brushstroke to the vast canvas we've been painting for millennia. And yet, despite the science, despite the engineering, there is always something poetic about these places. They are quiet outposts on the edge of the infinite. They do not roar with power, but hum with patience. They are not monuments to human dominance, but to our humility. Every observatory, whether ancient or modern, whispers the same truth, that to know the universe is to listen, to pause, to let the cosmos speak, and to accept that we may never hear every answer, but that does not make the questions any less beautiful. As you lie here now, gently drifting into sleep, let yourself float above the earth. Imagine hovering beside Hubble, or resting atop Mauna Kea, or standing in the chill wind of the Andes, watching the sky unfold. Imagine the stars overhead, as they once were seen by shepherds and scholars, by builders and priests, by you and me. Let your breath slow, your muscles soften, and your thoughts settle like stardust. The observatory, any observatory, is not just a place of science. It is a sanctuary, a temple, a mirror. It reflects our longing, our curiosity, our quiet reverence for the unknown. And as your eyes close and the night deepens, remember, the sky is still there, the stars still turn, and the story continues. Even as the 21st century unfolds with its humming satellites, data streams, and artificial intelligence, the role of the observatory remains more essential than ever, though it continues to evolve quietly, adapting to the tempo of a changing world. In an age of noise and speed, these places still stand as oases of silence, reminders of our slow, patient relationship with the stars. In Hawaii, on the summit of Mauna Kea, more than a dozen observatories perch above the clouds, nestled among volcanic rock and ancient Hawaiian sacred ground. These telescopes, some of the most advanced ever built, have scanned the skies with unmatched clarity, taking advantage of the thin atmosphere and minimal light pollution. But even here, where science stretches toward the edges of space, cultural reverence still echoes in the wind, reminding all who observe that the sky is not just a frontier, it is also a legacy. Indigenous communities have long known what astronomers now confirm, that the stars are not silent, they speak, they guide, they remember. Meanwhile, new types of observatories are rising, not with domes or mirrors, but with code and sensors. The Vera-C, Rubin Observatory in Chile is preparing to map the entire night sky every few nights, capturing the ever-shifting ballet of stars, galaxies, and transient cosmic events. This telescope, part of the Legacy Survey of Space and Time, won't just gaze, it will watch, compare, and record, creating a living, breathing timeline of the sky. No longer will observatories merely capture a still image of the cosmos. They will capture its pulse, its rhythm, its changes. In deep underground caverns, hidden beneath mountains or ice sheets, other observatories now listen not with light, but with neutrinos, subatomic particles that pass through matter almost without a trace. The Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory, buried deep within the South Pole's frozen core, is one such place. There, a grid of sensors embedded in the ice waits for the faintest flashes of blue light, signatures of interactions that took place billions of light years away. These observatories do not look up, they look inward and downward, and across dimensions once thought unreachable. And yet they are driven by the same longing, to understand, to witness, to stand in quiet awe before something greater. In space, the James Webb Space Telescope has begun a new chapter in cosmic observation. Orbiting far from Earth's warmth and noise, it unfolds like a flower in the dark, its golden mirrors tuned to infrared light, seeing not just stars and galaxies, but the earliest glow of the universe's birth. It peers back 13 billion years, glimpsing structures formed when the universe was still young and fragile. Every image it sends home is a time capsule, a hush from a moment so distant, so ancient, that it defies imagination. And yet we understand it, we receive it, because we have always been receivers, always listening, always wondering. Even now in homes, on rooftops, in backyards, people set up modest telescopes or simply lie under the stars. The observatory has never belonged only to scientists or scholars. It belongs to anyone who pauses, looks up, and wonders what lies beyond. It is in the child tracing constellations, in the elderly man remembering the eclipse of his youth, in the artist painting the sky's colors, in the poet writing verses under moonlight. It is in you, here, now, listening, resting, letting go of your day, letting the story of the stars hold you gently. As you breathe in, imagine the cool air atop a mountain observatory. As you breathe out, imagine the soft hum of a telescope turning to follow Saturn. As your body relaxes, let your mind drift among the stars, quiet, endless, familiar. These places we call observatories are not just structures of steel and glass. They are our extensions, our reach, our quiet attempt to find meaning in the infinite. And whether buried in ice, planted on deserts, floating in orbit, or simply drawn in chalk on a schoolyard floor, they all say the same thing. Look, wait, listen, the universe is speaking, and tonight, in the safety of stillness, you are listening. The stars are still turning, the night is still wide, and your place beneath it is exactly where you need to be. As the future gently approaches, the concept of the observatory continues to evolve, not just in structure or technology, but in meaning. What began as humble stone markers aligned to solstices has transformed into global networks of observatories, operating in perfect synchrony, scanning every wavelength of light, tracking movements from the edge of our solar system to the farthest galaxies known. But alongside the advancements in mirrors, sensors, and satellite arrays, a quieter transformation is also unfolding. The observatory is becoming something more abstract, no longer just a physical place on Earth, but a way of seeing, a perspective shared by many across the globe. Today, networks like the Event Horizon Telescope link observatories across continents, forming one virtual telescope the size of the Earth itself. In April of 2019, this collaboration produced the first ever image of a black hole, a glowing ring of light surrounding a shadow so dense and heavy that even photons cannot escape its pull. This moment was not just a triumph of technology. It was the result of countless hours of silent observation, coordination, and a shared human desire to witness the invisible. Scientists waited patiently for clear skies across multiple continents, synchronized atomic clocks, and combined datasets that filled hard drives flown by hand across oceans. All so we could see something our ancestors could only imagine. It was a moment of collective observation, billions of eyes looking at one blurry golden circle and recognizing it as a doorway to something ancient and strange. At the same time, citizen science has begun to blur the lines between expert and observer. With open-source databases and accessible sky mapping tools, individuals around the world contribute to discoveries. From amateur astronomers spotting comets to students identifying exoplanets in Pompeo archive telescope data, the observatory has become more democratic, more open, more human. It no longer matters whether you're on a mountaintop in Chile or a balcony in Brooklyn. What matters is the act of noticing, of caring enough to pause and look. And as light pollution continues to spread across urban skies, many modern observatories now fight not only for funding or access, but for darkness itself. They campaign for the preservation of dark skies, recognizing that without true night, we lose not only data, but something deeply human, the ability to connect with the cosmos through our own eyes. In this way, every observatory is also a guardian of night, of wonder, of time. Some look upward with telescopes, others listen with radio antennas. Some track particles underground, others launch mirrors into orbit, or sail through space on solar panels. And some, the quietest of all, live in memory, in stories passed down, in dreams of stars drawn on cave walls, in myths whispered by firelight. For even in places where observatories never stood, people have always watched the sky. The Inuit reading ice and star positions, the Polynesians navigating by constellations invisible to those on land, the Aboriginal Australians mapping stories in the Milky Way. The sky has always been a library, open to all, waiting to be read slowly, patiently, night after night. As you lie here now, safe and warm, think of all those who have looked up before you: a shepherd in the desert, a monk in a stone tower, a sailor crossing rough waters, a child curled beside a window, all watching, wondering, waiting. You are part of that quiet lineage, that long thread of curiosity that connects hearts across centuries. The observatory, whether carved in stone or etched in starlight, is not just a tool. It is a reflection of us, of our longing to see beyond, to understand what lies just out of reach, to feel the beauty of knowing how small we are and how vast the night truly is. Let that thought hold you now. Let it slow your breath. Let it soften your muscles and quiet your mind. Outside, the stars continue their ancient dance. Somewhere, a telescope turns gently toward Jupiter. A computer hums softly with new data. And in a small room, you rest, listening, breathing, becoming still. The universe waits for no one, but it welcomes everyone who chooses to look. And in this quiet moment, you are looking, not with your eyes, but with something deeper, something that remembers, something that dreams, something that listens. Through all its transformations, from the simplest stone circles to the most advanced space-based arrays, the observatory has remained one of humanity's most poetic creations, a structure born not from necessity, but from longing. Longing to understand, to connect, to place ourselves in the context of something greater than the small circle of our daily lives. It's easy to forget in the blur of modern existence just how rare and extraordinary it is that we can even ask questions about the universe at all. That our species, with fragile bodies and flickering lifespans, has found ways to measure the age of stars, to map the cosmic background radiation, to decode the elements of distant suns from the color of their light. And yet this entire journey, from the ancient markers of Nabta Playa to the orbiting mirrors of James Webb, has not been one of conquest or speed. It has been slow, gentle, careful. Each observatory, no matter the era, has embodied the same truth, that knowledge comes not through force, but through patience. It comes through repetition, through silence, through watching the same point in the sky, night after night, year after year, until something changes, or confirms itself, or quietly reveals a pattern. And so much of what we now know about gravity, motion, time, light was born from this stillness. It is perhaps the greatest paradox of all, that by standing still and looking outward, we have moved farther than we ever imagined. In the coming decades, new observatories will rise, not just on Earth, but on the Moon, perhaps even on Mars. Plans are already underway for lunar radio telescopes built in the cratered silence of the far side, shielded from Earth's noisy interference. Other designs imagine entire interferometers stretched across kilometers of space, detecting gravitational waves from colliding black holes, measuring ripples in spacetime itself. These observatories will not have windows or visitors or domes to open. They will float, whisper, listen. They will extend our senses beyond the limits of flesh and bone. And even then, their mission will be the same as those who carved stones to mark the solstice: to observe, to witness, to remain present. And here on Earth, digital sky surveys and machine learning algorithms will catalog billions of stars and galaxies, finding the rare, the transient, the strange. But even as machines grow more capable, the human observer will still matter. Because to observe is not just to collect data, it is to wonder, to feel the movement of the stars not only as motion, but as meaning. The observatory, after all, is not only a machine, it is a mirror. It reflects the soul of its creator. It shows us what we value, what we search for, what we hope to find. That is why, even now, when most of the sky is invisible behind the glow of cities, there are still those who seek the dark, who climb mountains, drive into deserts, or simply lie on their rooftops, searching for a glimpse of the Milky Way. Because something ancient calls to us when we see the stars, a memory deeper than history, a truth beyond words. The same stars that guided ancient navigators, that inspired poets, that watched over the birth of cities and the fall of empires. They are still there, quietly shining, and we, for all our progress, are still the same species that once gathered in silence to track their movement, to mark their return, to wonder what they meant. Tonight, as you rest beneath your own sky, know that you are not alone. Somewhere, a scientist is peering into the darkness, adjusting a lens, noting a flicker. Somewhere, a child is pointing upward, asking a question that has no answer. Somewhere, an engineer is designing the next eye that will open on the cosmos. And here, in this quiet space between thought and sleep, you too are part of that lineage, a watcher, a dreamer, a soft breath beneath the stars. Let that thought cradle you now. Let your body grow heavy, your mind grow still. The universe continues its quiet turning. The observatories, scattered across land and sea and sky, continue their patient vigil. And you are exactly where you need to be, listening, wondering, remembering. As our journey through the long and quiet history of astronomical observatories continues, we begin to see more clearly that this story has never really been about buildings or technology or even discovery. At its core, it is a story about stillness, about learning how to wait, about the humble, deliberate act of looking up and staying with that gaze long enough for the universe to speak back. There is something profoundly human in that gesture. To observe is to trust that what lies beyond is worth knowing, that time spent in silence is not wasted, but sacred. Observatories, in all their forms, have honored this belief. Whether made of sand and bone, or steel and circuit, they are rooted in the same instinct: to pause, to wonder, to watch. And over time, these places have become more than instruments of science. They've become instruments of presence. In Japan, for instance, ancient stargazing was not separate from art or poetry or the rhythms of the seasons. The stars were part of life, woven into haiku, paintings, and rituals. Observatories were not just about celestial mechanics. They were about harmony, about aligning oneself with the natural order. And in India, sky watching remained intertwined with timekeeping, philosophy, and spiritual practice. At Jantar Mantar, the massive astronomical observatories built in the 18th century, you can still see giant stone instruments rising like sculptures, casting shadows that measure time with elegant precision. Standing beside them, one feels not the rush of modern science, but the slow dignity of a world content to observe with patience and reverence. The instruments are vast, open to the sky, and unapologetically slow. They do not blink or beep. They wait. And in that waiting, they invite stillness. In the Islamic world, early observatories were often attached to libraries and schools. Knowledge was not separated into compartments. It flowed interconnected. Astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and faith all grew from the same root. The observatory was a room, a rooftop, a dome, somewhere that minds could meet the sky without distraction. The work done there was not noisy. It was quiet, meticulous, beautiful, and it echoes still in our vocabulary, in our calendars, in our understanding of time and space. Even today, the stars are with us in ways we rarely notice. In the names of our months, in the timing of our holidays, in the stories we tell to children at bedtime. We have built a civilization that runs on ancient sky watching, whether we remember it or not. And that brings us back to the modern world, a world of glowing screens and rushing clocks, of deadlines and distractions. In this world, the observatory stands as something rare and necessary, a place without hurry, a space for quiet, a commitment to long-term thinking in a world obsessed with immediacy. The people who work in observatories today often speak of a kind of peace they feel, standing alone in the dark, surrounded by silence, waiting for a telescope to finish its slow movement, knowing that what they see may not be for them, but for generations to come. Some observatories measure things we cannot even touch: dark energy, gravitational waves, the cosmic microwave background. Others measure things so faint that it takes years just to detect a pattern. And yet, we persist, because something in us understands that knowledge is not a race, that wonder does not obey the clock, that some truths require decades, centuries, even millennia to reveal themselves. The observatory teaches us patience, not just with the sky, but with ourselves. It reminds us that slowness is not failure, that silence is not absence, that looking is not the same as seeing, and that real seeing requires time. As you rest now, drifting between waking and sleep, imagine yourself standing in the great chain of observers, past and present. You are not alone. You are joined by ancient astronomers, poets, monks, navigators, children, scientists, and dreamers. All of them watching, all of them waiting, all of them drawn to the same quiet mystery above. Let that thought settle you. Let it hold you like a blanket. The night is long, but it is not empty. The stars are turning. The observatories are listening. And somewhere in that quiet space between wonder and rest, so are you. As we continue our quiet journey through the long arc of human sky watching, we begin to see how the observatory is not only a scientific tool, it is a cultural artifact, a mirror of how different societies across time have understood themselves in relation to the cosmos. In ancient Greece, thinkers like Ptolemy and Hipparchus did not have observatories in the modern sense, but they relied on observation, systematic, careful, and persistent. Hipparchus, working in Rhodes in the 2nd century BCE, used simple tools to chart the positions of stars, and in doing so, he discovered something profound: the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble in Earth's axis that changes the position of the stars over millennia. This was not something that could be seen in a day or even a year. It was only visible through slow, thoughtful comparison across generations. One of the earliest signs that astronomy was not just about the sky, but about time itself. And it wasn't only the Greeks. In Korea, the Cheomseongdae Observatory still stands. Built in the 7th century and considered the oldest surviving observatory in East Asia. Made of stone, circular, and hollow, its purpose is still partly mysterious, but its presence tells us everything we need to know. That long before telescopes or satellites, people everywhere looked up and sought patterns. They believed the sky held answers. They believed the heavens were more than decoration. They were a language. And so the observatory became a place of translation, a space where silence met interpretation. In this way, observatories were never isolated buildings. They were always connected to fields, to temples, to cities. In early Europe, monasteries often played the role of observatories, where monks recorded celestial events alongside weather patterns and agricultural cycles. They saw the sky as a calendar, a guide, and a spiritual text. Even comets and eclipses were seen not as threats, but as messages. And while today we interpret those events differently, the reverence remains. In fact, one might say that the modern observatory has inherited the quiet dignity of the monastery. Still watchful, devoted, the shift from mystical to scientific did not erase the soul of skywatching. It simply changed the language we used. And still, that same essence lingers. The observatory is where curiosity becomes commitment, where the fleeting glance becomes the long gaze. In more recent history, urban observatories became popular during the 19th and early 20th centuries, not just for professionals but for the public. Planetariums and domed towers appeared in cities, offering people a chance to see Saturn's rings or Jupiter's moons for the first time. These experiences were not grand in scale, but they were grand in meaning. For a child to see the craters of the moon through a telescope, to understand that those shadows are real, ancient, and silent, that is a kind of awakening. It is the same awakening that early civilizations must have felt, looking at the horizon and realizing the stars were not random, that they followed rules, that the sky was not chaos, but quiet order. This shift in perspective, this sudden intimacy with the infinite, is what observatories make possible. And now, as more of us live in cities lit by artificial light, where the night sky is often dimmed or invisible, these observatories become even more precious. They protect access to darkness, to wonder. They give us back the stars, if only for a moment. And through them, we remember something important, that we are not above the sky, nor beneath it, but within it. As you rest here tonight, gently easing into sleep, imagine yourself walking slowly through a quiet observatory. Feel the cool air, the gentle hum of instruments, the soft glow of star maps on paper. You run your fingers along brass dials or touch the smooth curve of a telescope dome. And outside, beyond the glass, the stars continue their slow turning. You are part of that motion, part of that stillness. Let that thought calm your breathing. Let it bring warmth to your chest. The night may be vast, but it is not empty. It is full of memory, full of patience, full of light traveling across unimaginable distances, arriving now just as you close your eyes. The observatory receives that light, and so do you, quietly, gently, without rush. You are watching the sky, not with your eyes now, but with your breath, with your presence, and that is enough. And now, as we reach the final part of this quiet journey through the history of astronomical observatories, let us return not to the instruments or discoveries, but to the feeling, the quiet hum that runs beneath it all. The feeling of looking up, the feeling of watching something you cannot touch or change, and yet feeling deeply connected to it. That feeling has never left us, even as centuries passed and technologies advanced. The observatory, in its truest form, is a response to that feeling. A structure built not from necessity, but from wonder. And when we trace the path from the first human who marked the rising of a star with a carved stone to the engineers placing gold-coated mirrors in space, we see the same gesture repeated. A willingness to pause, to listen, to devote time to something that gives nothing back but meaning. There is something almost radical in that choice, especially today. In a world that measures value in speed, productivity, and results, the observatory reminds us of the beauty of patience, of long questions, of answers that arrive only after decades, or maybe never at all. And yet we keep building them. We build them on mountaintops, on islands, in deserts, in orbit. We tune them to light, to sound, to vibration, to particles that pass silently through us all the time. We build them for the stars we can see, and for those we cannot. We build them not to control the universe, but to understand our place within it. And in doing so, we return to a kind of stillness that feels almost sacred. Even now, late at night, somewhere a telescope is tracking a star. Somewhere, a radio dish is listening to the faint murmur of a distant galaxy. Somewhere, a team is reviewing data from a supernova that exploded millions of years ago. Somewhere, a student is sitting alone at a desk, reading about the curvature of space, dreaming of distant planets, wondering what it all means. And somewhere, perhaps not too far from here, someone is lying quietly in bed, just like you, listening to the story of the sky, and letting that story soften the edges of the day. Because the observatory is not only a place, it is a mindset. It is a way of being present with mystery, of becoming comfortable with not knowing, of seeing beauty in the unmeasurable, It teaches us to be humble, to look outward, and in doing so, look inward. It teaches us to wait, to notice, to be amazed. And it invites us into a relationship with the cosmos that is gentle, ongoing, and alive. Whether you are an astronomer in a high-tech lab or a dreamer staring out a window on a sleepless night, the invitation is the same: to step into the quiet, to observe, and in observing, to remember how vast the night is and how peacefully small we are within it. So as your breath slows now and your body sinks deeper into rest, let the observatory hold you one last time. Let its silence become your silence. Let the stars turn above you, not as distractions, but as companions. Let go of the need to figure it all out. Let go of the rush. Let go of the noise. There is nothing you need to do right now, nowhere you need to be. You are already part of the turning sky. The same stars that shone over the pyramids, over the temples, over the ships at sea, they shine for you too. The same night that carried the hopes of ancient watchers carries yours. So sleep now quietly, softly, with the observatory as your companion. Let it watch the sky for you while you drift into dreams. Let it keep its gentle vigil, recording the light of long-dead stars while you rest beneath the living ones. And when you wake, may you carry with you the calm of the night sky, the patience of a long observation, and the quiet joy of knowing that even in stillness, you are moving with everything. That brings our last story to a close. Before we move on to the next quiet tale, if you've enjoyed this peaceful journey through time, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing for more sleepy stories just like this one. Now let's continue with the next calm chapter in our Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we'll follow the quiet builders of the Roman aqueducts. In the stillness of ancient mornings, before the clamor of the Roman Forum, before the wheels of carts scraped the stone roads, and before the voices of merchants echoed through crowded streets, there were footsteps, quiet, measured, deliberate, belonging to the men who built something not meant to dazzle with height or color, but to serve with quiet constancy. The Roman aqueducts, often overshadowed by grand temples or colosseums, were not built to amaze crowds, but to sustain them. They brought water, not glory, but water, the quiet foundation of civilization. And yet, behind every clean bath, every lush garden, every flowing fountain in ancient Rome, there stood the silent work of the aqueduct builders. These builders did not stand at the heart of ceremonies. Their names were rarely etched into stone, but their work flowed through the veins of the empire. It began, always, at a spring, a distant, hidden place in the hills where water welled from the earth with ancient patience. The engineers, following the methods of the Etruscans and Greeks before them, studied the land for days, weeks, months. They walked, they calculated, they imagined the slow descent of water across valleys, hills, and forests. No pumps, no engines, only gravity and geometry. The aqueduct would rise and fall gently, losing only a few inches every 100 feet, so that water would flow naturally, without ever rushing. It was a delicate balance. Too steep, and the water would erode the channel. Too flat, and it would stagnate. So they walked again. They placed rods and strings and levels. They marked the path with chalk and stone. They imagined the invisible river that would one day flow through rock and bridge and tunnel. And then, they began to dig. The work was slow. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet rhythm of picks against earth, of stone being shaped, of lime being mixed. The workers built underground channels first, called specus, arched tunnels lined with waterproof cement, hidden beneath fields and forests. They moved carefully, measuring the slope with a tool called a chorobates, a simple wooden board with a groove of water. If the water stayed level, the channel was true. If it tilted, the angle was wrong. No computers, no shortcuts, only patience. When hills blocked the path, they carved through them. When valleys opened up, they raised stone arches. The arches are what we remember today, graceful, mathematical, spanning the landscape with an almost serene beauty. But they were only a small portion of the whole. Most of the aqueducts lived underground, invisible, humming with quiet flow. And even as the empire grew, stretching from Britain to Syria, the principle remained the same. Find the water, guide it gently, let it flow. In Rome itself, The water arrived through multiple aqueducts, layered like veins. The Aqua Appia, the oldest, built in 312 BCE. The Aqua Claudia, elegant and strong. The Aqua Marcia, stretching over 50 miles from distant springs. Each delivered not just water, but life. To the public baths, to the fountains in market squares, to the basins in private homes. The sound of water, steady, clear, continuous, was the soft heartbeat of Roman daily life, and few gave thought to how it arrived. But the builders knew. They had walked every step. They had stood in muddy trenches, in the sun and the cold, carving channels no one would see. They had laid the foundation not just of plumbing, but of urban civilization. For without water, there is no city, no people, no peace. And the Roman aqueducts, in their quiet, unhurried way, ensured that peace. Even now, some still stand. The arches outside Rome, the fragments in Gaul, the ghost traces beneath modern roads. Their silence is not emptiness, it is memory. It is the echo of flowing water and of those who built the path for it to follow. As you rest now, picture them, anonymous, tireless, steady, the quiet builders of stone and gravity, and let their story flow through your thoughts like the water they once guided, soft, slow, and enduring. As the Roman aqueduct system expanded over centuries, what began as a modest underground flow of water evolved into a vast network of engineering that would quietly sustain one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. But behind this infrastructure, invisible to the public eye, were systems so carefully calculated, so precisely built, that they continued functioning long after emperors fell and cities were conquered. What is remarkable is not only the scale of these aqueducts, but the philosophy behind their construction, a philosophy of restraint, of balance, of aligning human effort with nature's quiet laws. Roman engineers did not force water into submission. They worked with it. They listened to the land. They followed the gentle slope of gravity rather than challenge it. From distant springs in mountain valleys, water would begin its slow descent, carried by spicuous channels, often encased in concrete, lined with waterproof pozzolana cement, reinforced by brick, stone, or clay. These materials were chosen not just for strength, but for endurance. For the Romans did not think in years, they thought in centuries. They built so that generations they would never know might still bathe, drink, and live from the flow of their work. Along the way, they added sedimentation tanks, simple basins where impurities could settle. They introduced inspection shafts and maintenance corridors, allowing teams to descend, clean, and repair without interrupting the flow. They placed air vents along the path to reduce pressure and ensure smooth, quiet movement. In this way, the aqueduct was not just a pipe or a channel, it was a living system, and all of it moved slowly. The average water speed through an aqueduct was barely a trickle, about the pace of a slow walk, but it never stopped. That was the genius. The water never had to rush, because it was always flowing. And in the city of Rome, it arrived with quiet reliability. The water entered the city at elevated distribution tanks, known as castellum aquae, where it was divided into smaller pipes and redirected throughout the city. Some was sent to the great public baths, the baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, vast palaces of water, steam, and stone. Others fed the fountains, keeping public squares alive with sound and movement. Still more supplied private homes, especially those of the elite, who had access to water for gardens, pools, and even flushing toilets. But the majority of the water, up to 300 million gallons per day, was freely accessible. The aqueducts were not built to serve a few, but to serve all. In this, the Romans were unusually generous for their time. Water was not a commodity. It was a civic good, something to be shared, something to be honored. And so, at street corners, in small courtyards, in crowded markets, fountains were placed, simple stone basins where anyone could drink, fill a jug, or splash their face after a long day. And though few stopped to think about it, that water had traveled for miles, over hills and beneath roads, through tunnels and across bridges, all thanks to the unseen labor of engineers and workers who never raised their voices or demanded praise. They simply followed the line. They measured, they carved, they shaped. They built arches that seemed to float, bridges that cut across valleys like whispers. They worked with the same care, whether the aqueduct passed through a village or a forest, whether it would be seen or hidden. Because their goal was not recognition, it was flow. Constant, clean, invisible flow. And perhaps that's why these structures have lasted so long. They were not built to impress. They were built to endure. Even as barbarians sacked the cities, even as emperors fell and languages changed, the aqueducts often kept working. They fed the medieval fountains. They watered the early gardens. They became the backbone of cities that forgot who had first laid the stones. As you rest here tonight, think of that quiet resilience, of structures built not for glory, but for service, of hands that placed each stone with care, of eyes that measured shadows, that tracked slopes, that knew how to balance precision with patience. The builders of Rome's aqueducts did not shout. They did not rush. But they left something behind. Something that still flows, even now. In the quiet discipline of Roman engineering, nothing was left to chance. Not the slope of the channel, not the texture of the cement, not even the shape of the stones. Every aqueduct was a reflection of care, of geometry, and of respect for water itself. The Roman engineers treated water as something alive, something to be guided with honor, not forced with violence. It was this philosophy, quiet and precise, that made their aqueducts last longer than kings, longer than dynasties. And it wasn't just Rome that benefited. As the empire expanded, so too did its aqueducts, spanning across provinces and frontiers, adapting to different landscapes, different climates, and different communities. In Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, and even as far away as Britain, Roman engineers surveyed foreign soils with the same quiet confidence. They found springs, measured gradients, planned routes that would bring clean water to newly founded cities or veteran colonies. In Nîmes, the Pont du Gard still stands, a stunning triple-tiered aqueduct bridge that spans the Garden River Valley with graceful balance. Its arches, carved from golden limestone, were placed with such care that they required no mortar. And though it towers over the landscape, it does not shout, it blends. It harmonizes with the hills, the river, the sky. Its purpose was simple: carry water from a distant spring to a Roman settlement. But in doing so, it became a masterpiece of modesty, not built for glory, but for use. And even today, over 2,000 years later, it still carries echoes of the footsteps of the men who built it, workers with calloused hands and silent determination. Elsewhere, in Segovia, Spain, another aqueduct winds through the heart of the city, its towering granite arches still intact. It requires no concrete, only pressure, balance, and the careful knowledge of those who understood stone as deeply as they understood water. These were not loud achievements, they were quiet revolutions. And though they served their purpose, bringing water to baths, fountains, and homes, they also taught something deeper: that human ingenuity, when paired with patience, can become timeless. The builders often worked in silence. There were no cheering crowds, no dramatic ceremonies, only the rhythmic sound of chisels, the murmur of engineers comparing notes, the creak of carts carrying stones. And yet, from these modest sounds, a kind of music emerged, a music of balance, of logic, of care. Some of the aqueducts tunneled through hills, some crossed flat plains, some curved elegantly to avoid unstable ground. And always the water moved slowly, steadily, guided by hands that understood its nature. Along the way, the builders left behind clues, inscriptions carved into stone, technical markers, repair notes, and sometimes even graffiti, playful or proud. These human fingerprints remind us that behind the grand design were real people, some engineers, some soldiers, some enslaved laborers, all contributing in different ways to something that would outlast them all. Their work was not glamorous. It was often hot, dusty, exhausting, but they knew its value, and perhaps that quiet pride was enough. Over time, aqueducts began to inspire more than just admiration. They inspired imitation. Later civilizations studied Roman methods, copied their measurements, borrowed their materials. In Renaissance Italy, aqueducts were restored. In Enlightenment Europe, engineers wrote about them with wonder. Even today, city planners and hydraulic engineers look back at Roman systems with awe, not because they were advanced in tools, but because they were wise in principle. The aqueduct did not demand power to run. It did not need fuel. It needed only gravity and trust. It worked with nature, not against it. As you rest now, think of that simple genius. A channel cut through earth, tilted just enough to flow. A line that connects mountain to city, spring to fountain. A structure that whispers, not commands. And the people who made it, not with haste, but with care. Let their legacy fill your thoughts, like water filling a basin, calm, quiet, steady. As night settles over the remnants of ancient cities, the aqueducts remain, sometimes whole, sometimes broken, sometimes half-buried under centuries of change, but always whispering the same story of quiet genius, of labor guided by patience, and of a civilization that saw value not only in grandeur, but in flow. These structures, once pulsing with water drawn from distant springs, are now often silent, their channels dry, their arches weathered by time. Yet they endure, not only in stone, but in spirit, because they represent something profoundly human, the desire to bring something essential from far away, to make the distant useful, to turn what was once out of reach into something present and sustaining. In every aqueduct, there was a journey, not just for the water, but for the builders who traced it. Their calculations were done without modern instruments, their measurements confirmed by sight, by plumb lines, by water itself. They would follow the path on foot, crossing steep ridges, meandering through valleys, always seeking the most natural course, the most efficient descent. And once the route was known, the building began. In some places, it took decades, in others, generations. But time was not an enemy, time was a partner. The builders understood that haste could mean collapse, but patience would bring endurance. So they worked slowly, cutting stone blocks to fit with minimal gaps, sealing joints with lime and volcanic ash, reinforcing channels with layers of clay and tile. And always they listened, to the echo of picks against earth, to the subtle sound of water returning after a repair, to the silence that meant everything was working just as it should. The aqueduct was not a machine that roared. It was a presence that whispered. Even as cities around it grew louder, filled with the cries of vendors, the chants of priests, the music of festivals, the aqueduct remained still, flowing just beneath or above the noise, serving quietly. And when the empire weakened, and its cities fell to war, famine, or neglect, the aqueducts did not collapse immediately. They lingered. They kept flowing. Sometimes they were repurposed, turned into shelters, walls, or pathways. Sometimes they were buried under new buildings. Sometimes they were simply forgotten. But in many places they survived. And when later generations rediscovered them, they did so with reverence. Not because the aqueducts were beautiful, though they often were, but because they had been built with such discipline, such care, such understanding of nature's subtle rules. Even today, modern engineers look at their gradients and marvel. A drop of only a few centimeters per 100 meters, maintained over miles. A channel that curves gently around hills, or crosses open land with a grace that seems effortless, but was anything but. These were not crude approximations. They were precise decisions. And the result was not just the delivery of water, but the cultivation of trust. Trust that tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that, the fountain would flow, the bath would fill, the garden would drink. That quiet consistency made life in Rome not only possible but pleasant. It gave people a sense of order, of dependability, of peace. And perhaps that is why the aqueducts still feel alive. They are not ruins. They are reminders of what can be achieved without noise, of what can endure without fame, of what can flow through generations when built with intention. As you lie still now, letting your thoughts drift like water through a channel, imagine walking along one of these ancient paths. The sun is low, the stones are warm beneath your feet. The arches stretch ahead, calm and unwavering. You hear the faint sound of water, soft, steady, sure. You are not rushing. You are simply walking like those who built before you, with purpose, with peace, with patience. In the gentle decline of Rome's power, as the outer provinces fractured and the heart of the empire grew more uncertain, the aqueducts did not falter all at once. They remained, as if unaware of the shifting tides of politics, continuing their quiet task of delivering life to the city that had once ruled the known world. Even as emperors were overthrown and walls crumbled under siege, the aqueducts, so often taken for granted, kept flowing. Their water fed the fountains in nearly empty forums. Their arches still cast shadows over roads, now traveled by invaders and traders alike. Their builders were long gone, their names mostly forgotten, but their work endured because it had never depended on glory. It had depended on function, on sound design, on understanding gravity, stone, water, and time. And in the centuries that followed, long after Rome was no longer Rome, the ruins of the aqueducts inspired something deep and almost spiritual in those who passed beneath them. Medieval pilgrims wrote of them with reverence. Renaissance artists sketched their curves and proportions. Scholars stood in their shadow and wondered how such precision had been achieved with so little noise, so little arrogance. What they saw, perhaps without always realizing it, was not just a technical achievement, but a way of thinking. The aqueduct was never about extravagance. It was about service, unseen, steady, enduring. And that idea lived on, in whispered ways. It lived on in the city planners who designed water systems for the towns of early Europe. It lived on in the engineers who built canals and reservoirs. It lived on in the belief that infrastructure, though invisible to the eye, is essential to the soul of a city. Without water, without flow, without the quiet rhythm of care, even the grandest places fall into chaos. The Romans had known this. That is why they invested in aqueducts even more than temples, why they placed engineers in positions of power, why they carved long tunnels through hills not for prestige, but for pressure balance and maintenance access, why they used sediment basins and distribution tanks and overflow mechanisms that would not become standard again for over 1,000 years. And still today, in Rome and in former Roman territories, pieces of these systems remain. Sometimes they run alongside highways. Sometimes they are covered in vines. Sometimes they form the backdrop of modern neighborhoods, barely noticed by the people who pass them each day. But they are still there, watching, holding stories, reminding us that the greatest human creations are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones that simply last. And beyond the physical structures, the aqueducts leave behind a different kind of legacy, one of humility, a reminder that service does not always need a stage, that work done in silence, done with care, done with long-term purpose, can shape the world just as much as speeches or wars. The aqueducts ask us to reconsider our idea of greatness, not in terms of height or spectacle or headlines, but in quiet continuity, in usefulness, in grace. As you rest now, letting your breath settle into a soft, even rhythm, think of those who laid the stones, who checked the slope, who walked the route by foot again and again to make sure the grade was true, who mixed the mortar by hand, who bent over stone channels in cold dawn light, who never saw the full impact of their work, and yet built as if they would. Their hands are gone, their voices lost to time, but their work flows on, sometimes dry, sometimes overgrown, but still here. Still telling a story, still whispering beneath the noise of modern life. And as your eyes grow heavier, and your thoughts grow still, let that whisper stay with you. Let it remind you that even in your smallest efforts, there is meaning. Even in stillness, there is movement. Even in silence, there is strength. As centuries passed and empires shifted like sand, the remnants of the Roman aqueducts remained, not as grand highways of water anymore, but as silent sentinels scattered across the landscape, their curves softened by moss and time. Travelers passed under their arches without knowing their names. Shepherds rested in their shadows. Children played among their ruins. And yet, even in partial collapse, these structures carried with them a kind of memory, a blueprint not only of engineering, but of care, of quiet mastery, of a civilization that once understood the power of slowness. Historians and architects who came later would study the stones, tracing their alignment, their joinery, their choice of materials. They would marvel at how the arches had been spaced with mathematical precision, how the water channels were tilted so gently that the current never rushed, how the builders had known to avoid frost-prone areas and landslides long before geology had a name. These aqueducts were not only built to last, they were built to listen, to the land, to the water, to the seasons. And they told a story, not with words, but with presence. A story of design that had no Google. A story of men who understood that beauty could emerge from function, that grace could live in stone, and that permanence was not found in spectacle, but in purpose. In the age of kings and cathedrals that followed, many aqueducts were forgotten, hidden under newer cities, or scavenged for building materials. And yet the idea behind them, the principle of thoughtful, gravity-driven design, never truly vanished. It lay dormant in the earth like a buried spring, waiting to rise again. During the Renaissance, a time of rediscovery, artists and scholars began to sketch the ruins with admiration. They saw in the weathered stones a quiet dignity that no fortress could match. And slowly, the aqueduct came back into conversation, not just as a ruin, but as an ideal. Philosophers wrote about its simplicity, engineers praised its economy, and poets spoke of its patience, of how it served for centuries without complaint, how it bore no symbols of conquest or wealth, only the subtle line of continuous flow. The aqueduct did not ask for attention. It only asked to be true to its function. And in that truth, it found eternity. As modern cities developed their own water systems, using pumps and pipes and power grids, the lessons of Rome were not always remembered. Many systems were built quickly, patched together, designed for short-term solutions. They rusted, leaked, failed, and only then did people begin to look back. Back at the quiet stones, back at the gravity-fed channels, back at the way the Romans had designed not just for their lifetime, but for the lives that would follow. That is the deeper legacy of the aqueduct, not just how it worked, but why it worked for so long, because it was not rushed, because it was not proud, because it honored the slow path of water, and asked only to help it reach where it was needed. Today, if you stand near one of the surviving arches, whether in the countryside of Lazio or the heart of Segovia, you may hear nothing, no trickle, no echo, just the wind. But if you listen closely, there is still a rhythm, not of sound, but of intention, of stones laid in quiet sequence, of lines carved with care, of builders who did not need applause. They built for the sake of function, and in doing so, they touched something deeper than utility. They touched continuity. As you lie here now, safe and still, imagine walking along that ancient path. No cars, no wires, just the soft crunch of gravel beneath your sandals. The arch rises beside you, weathered and worn, but holding firm. The sun casts long shadows through the stone, and somewhere far ahead, a spring still flows, cool, steady, eternal. You are not lost. You are walking with the builders, step by step, toward something necessary, toward something timeless. As the sun dipped below the horizon in ancient times, and the city of Rome glowed softly under oil lamps and torches, the water still moved. It did not pause with sunset. It did not rest while citizens slept. It continued its quiet journey through channels, over arches, under roads, through vaulted conduits, and into the heart of the empire. This uninterrupted flow was not the product of magic, nor of chance, but of thoughtful planning, maintenance, and reverence. The aqueducts were not simply built and abandoned, they were tended like gardens. Teams of caretakers, known as curatores aquarum and aquarii, were assigned to watch over these systems. Their task was not glamorous. They were not celebrated in literature or carved into marble. Yet they were essential. They climbed into inspection shafts, monitored water pressure, cleared obstructions, and repaired cracks before they became disasters. They understood that the success of the aqueduct was not in its grandeur, but in its continuity. And so they served it daily, unseen but vital, maintaining not just the flow of water, but the rhythm of the city itself. In times of drought or damage or war, the aqueduct was one of the first systems to be defended or restored. Because without water, Rome did not function. Not its baths, not its fountains, not its bakeries, which relied on water-powered mills, not its people. Even the emperor's palace depended on the same steady current that fed the homes of ordinary citizens. Water was the great equalizer, transparent, tireless, impartial, and the aqueduct, though it spanned class and distance, required constant respect. When Rome's enemies wanted to weaken the city, they didn't always attack the walls. Sometimes they attacked the aqueducts. A single break in the line could disrupt entire districts, but time and again, the Romans rebuilt. They understood that restoring the water's path was as important as rebuilding a temple or a fortress, because the aqueduct was more than infrastructure. It was a symbol of Rome's soul, A soul that valued order, cleanliness, health, and public access. A soul that saw water not as a luxury, but a right. And that belief, radical for its time, left a quiet imprint on future civilizations. Long after the Western Roman Empire fell, fragments of aqueduct systems continued to operate. Farmers redirected broken channels to irrigate fields. Villages used surviving arches as bridges. Renaissance engineers mapped the old routes, marveling at their practicality. In the 1500s, Pope Sixtus V commissioned the restoration of parts of the Aqua Alexandrina and Aqua Marcia to bring clean water back to Rome, 15 centuries after their original construction. And even in the modern age, traces of these ancient waterworks continue to guide urban planning. Some lie buried beneath asphalt and concrete, hidden under parking garages and metro tunnels. Others stand exposed, crumbling but still elegant, surrounded by parks or countryside. Wherever they appear, they remind us of something deeper than history. They remind us that greatness does not always roar. Sometimes, it flows. And when it does, it leaves a mark not only on maps, but on minds. Because the aqueduct is not just a channel, it is a philosophy. A way of seeing the world not as something to conquer, but something to understand and serve. It is the belief that design should follow the shape of the land. That power should be quiet. That time should be honored, not resisted. As you drift further into rest, let that philosophy wash over you like cool water in a stone basin. Let it soften the noise of the day. Let it steady your breath. You are lying still now, but beneath that stillness is motion, slow, even, constant, just like the water, just like the aqueduct. A silent strength that asks for nothing, but gives everything. Even as modern life surges forward with digital signals, speeding cars, and cities pulsing with electricity, the story of the Roman aqueducts continues to echo. Not loudly, not obviously, but in quiet corners where water still flows because someone once cared enough to shape its path. The legacy of the aqueducts is not preserved only in museums or textbooks. It lingers in every fountain that trickles in a public square, in every irrigation canal that winds through countryside, in every underground pipe that delivers water without fanfare. In these systems, ancient or new, the spirit of Rome endures, not the Rome of emperors or battles, but the Rome of engineers, of masons, of those who built not for monuments, but for mornings. Each aqueduct tells a silent story of continuity, of something useful made beautiful through function alone. Their curves were not designed to impress, but to last. Their heights were not for pride, but for pressure. Their complexity was not indulgent, but intentional. These systems, designed 2,000 years ago, remind us that intelligence and restraint are not opposites. They are companions. The aqueducts were smart not because they were complicated, but because they were simple in the most elegant way. Their builders understood that water doesn't need to be pushed. It only needs to be guided. And they trusted that gravity, given time, would do the work. That trust, the willingness to work with nature instead of against it, is perhaps the most profound part of their legacy. In our modern age, where efficiency often means speed and visibility, the aqueducts invite a different kind of wisdom. The wisdom of things that take time. The wisdom of systems that do not announce themselves. The wisdom of building not just for today, but for centuries from now. If you walk the ancient roads of Rome, or the countryside of Provence, or the outskirts of Tarragona, you might come across an arch, half-crumbled, sun-warmed, silent. It may seem like a ruin, but it is more than that. It is a remnant of rhythm, a leftover line from a sentence once spoken by flowing water. It stood not because someone wanted to be remembered, but because someone wanted water to arrive where it was needed. It is the physical memory of purpose, of service, and even when the channel above it no longer carries water, the stone still carries intention. Perhaps that is why the aqueducts continue to capture our imagination, because they are not flashy, they are not loud, they do not demand attention, they simply endure. They ask us to see value in the unseen, in the slow, in the built to last. They remind us that what sustains us is often quiet, that the most essential things, like water, like air, like trust, arrive without announcement. As you sink deeper into rest now, let your mind drift through one of those channels. Let the sound of flowing water wash over the noise of the day. Let the measured stones beneath your feet remind you that not everything needs to move fast, that there is a kind of peace in the long journey, that there is grace in serving without credit, that what matters most is often what is done with care, with thought, and with time. And if you ever doubt the impact of quiet work, think of the aqueducts, still standing, still teaching, still flowing somewhere, in their own slow way. Let that thought stay with you as the night deepens. Let it become the rhythm of your breath. Let it carry you gently into dreams. The builders are long gone, their names are forgotten, but their work remains. And through it, they are not truly gone. They are simply continuing. In the quiet shadow of ancient arches, where weeds now grow between the stones and the wind whispers through hollow channels, the Roman aqueducts continue their silent testimony, not just to a civilization's technical mastery, but to its patience, its priorities, and its values. These structures, though largely still and dry now, once carried the very pulse of cities, moving not only water, but the idea that people could live together cleanly, safely, with dignity. The aqueducts were not designed as weapons, nor as palaces. They were not built to glorify a single ruler or to celebrate a military conquest. They were civic in the purest sense, constructed to serve many, to connect remote springs to dense communities, to turn landscape into lifeline. Each stone, each arch, each gradient carved into a hillside was placed with intention. And though centuries have passed and modern pipes have replaced ancient channels, the lessons held in those stones have not faded. They whisper across time to those who listen, reminding us that greatness is not always in spectacle, but in sustained care. A stone doesn't have to shout to carry weight. A system doesn't have to be fast to be wise. The aqueducts were born from slowness, from the deliberate study of land, from the humble knowledge that nature sets the rules and the builder's job is to listen. Roman engineers didn't try to change the flow of rivers. They sought out springs that already offered what was needed and built around them. They didn't rush water, they balanced it, using the gentle pull of gravity to create a flow that was smooth, steady, dependable. This principle, the idea of working with rather than against, applied not only to stone and water, but to the human systems behind the aqueducts. Teams were organized not by power, but by function. Surveyors, diggers, masons, plasterers, inspectors. Everyone had a role. And together, quietly, they brought distant water into crowded towns, enriching the lives of people they would never meet. The aqueducts thus became a silent form of generosity. They delivered refreshment without announcement. They made cities livable without demanding praise. And in doing so, they left behind not just infrastructure, but inspiration. Even today, architects, environmentalists, and urban designers look back at these systems for ideas. Systems that required no electricity, no pumps, just alignment and faith in time. In an age of noise and speed, the aqueducts still speak of rhythm, of trust, of permanence. If you walk beside one now, perhaps near Tivoli or Arles or Tarragona, you might notice how it draws the eye, not upward in awe, but forward in invitation. It asks you to follow, to walk at its pace, to see how it bends with the hills, respects the contours of the earth, and holds its shape even after empires fall. There is comfort in that. There is wisdom in that. And there is something deeply human in that quiet durability. As you lie here now, eyes growing heavier, let the shape of those arches guide your thoughts. Let them stretch across your imagination like bridges into calm. Picture the builders not as legends, but as workers with dust on their hands, adjusting each stone with care. Picture the flow of water moving slowly under sunlight, catching glimmers of sky as it travels. Picture a city asleep, its fountains still running, because somewhere, far away, someone long ago made sure the water would arrive. That is the legacy of the aqueducts, not only what they carried, but what they stood for: steadiness, service, silence. As the night deepens, breathe with that same rhythm. Let the stillness around you become like the stone, solid, steady, serene. There is no need to rush, no need to do, only to be, like the aqueduct, present, quiet, lasting. And so we come to the quiet end of our long and steady walk through the story of the Roman aqueducts, not with a dramatic finale, but with the same quiet grace that defined the structures themselves. These were not monuments meant to celebrate the fleeting rise of power, nor were they built to stand as grand declarations of victory. They were, instead, acts of care, a kind of invisible architecture that wove together land and life. Their function was simple: to bring water from the hills to the people, day after day, year after year, without fanfare, without failure. And yet, in that very simplicity, there was genius, there was beauty, there was something that speaks not only to the minds of engineers, but to the hearts of all who understand the importance of small things done well, of slow things done right, of quiet things that endure. When we think of Roman achievements, our minds may go first to marble temples or thundering legions. But perhaps the truest symbol of Rome's greatness is the steady whisper of water moving through stone, a movement not designed to conquer, but to sustain. The aqueducts did not change the world with noise. They changed it with presence, with consistency, with the slow certainty of water arriving where it was needed most. They remind us that civilization is not only built by force, but by function, not only by ambition, but by attention, not only by those who lead, but by those who build, carefully, patiently, and often anonymously. The arches still stand, not because they were praised, but because they were precise. The channels still trace their paths, not because someone demanded they last, but because someone took the time to make sure they would. And the water, though no longer flowing through every ancient line, still finds its way, in rivers, in pipes, in the quiet corners of cities shaped by those ancient designs. Today, when we drink from a tap or see a fountain bubbling in a square, we are touched by a distant echo of that Roman vision. That water should be near, clean, constant, and shared. The builders of the aqueducts may not have imagined satellites or skyscrapers or the glowing noise of the modern world, but they did imagine something even more enduring: the idea that what we build, if built with care, can outlive us. That purpose matters more than pride, that the greatest works may never carry the names of their creators. As you lie still now, the night deep around you, let your thoughts drift like water moving through ancient stone. Let them trace the curves of forgotten arches, flow through the cool dark of underground channels, rise across gentle bridges built one block at a time. Imagine the hands that placed those stones, tired hands, skilled hands, unnoticed hands. And imagine the moment so long ago when the water first arrived, a trickle, then a stream, then a dependable presence. Let that presence live within you now. Let it soften your thoughts, slow your breath, and ease your body into rest. For even as the world spins quickly above you, there is something within that moves more slowly. Something that understands patience, that values endurance, that honors the builders who did not rush. Tonight, you are one with that rhythm. You are one with the arches and the flow, one with the silent song of systems built to last. And as your mind drifts into sleep, remember this: that the aqueducts, though ancient, are still alive in the way they continue to guide, to teach, to inspire. They live not only in ruins, but in the idea that we too can build things that last. Not through force, not through speed, but through quiet, intentional care. So rest now, knowing that even in stillness, there is movement. Even in sleep, there is flow. And that, like the aqueduct, your presence, gentle, thoughtful, and enduring, has meaning. It carries something essential. It connects, it sustains, and it endures. That brings our last story to a close. Before we begin the next quiet chapter, if this gentle journey has helped you relax, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel for more soft stories like this one. Now, let's continue with the next calm episode in our Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we'll explore the daily life of a scribe in ancient Egypt. In the slow quiet of the Nile Valley, as the morning sun began to warm the limestone walls and the palm leaves rustled gently in the breeze, a man rose to begin his day. Not a farmer, not a soldier, not a priest, but a scribe. In ancient Egypt, the scribe was a figure of calm importance. He did not work the fields, nor lead armies, nor build monuments. His tools were not plows or chisels, but brush pens and small palettes of black and red ink. His world was made of signs and meaning, lines and rhythm, papyrus scrolls, and smooth wooden boards. To be a scribe was to be trusted with memory, with law, with the very fabric of administration that allowed the great civilization of the pharaohs to function. And yet his day was often simple, almost repetitive, built on patience, on precision, and on silence. He would wake with the early light, perhaps in a modest home near the temple or beside the scribal school, and wash his face with water drawn from a nearby well. His garments would be linen, light and plain, tied at the waist with a woven belt. There was no need for ornament. His identity was in his knowledge. On a small mat or bench, he would gather his tools, a reed pen carefully trimmed to a fine point, cakes of soot-based black ink and red ochre for titles and highlights, a water pot, a flat mixing slab, and sheets of smooth papyrus rolled tightly to protect them from dust and insects. He might review the previous day's work, reading slowly from right to left, top to bottom, his eyes trained to catch the smallest mark out of place. The script he used, hieratic or sometimes hieroglyphs, was not written quickly. Each stroke was purposeful. The scribe's job was not to decorate, but to preserve clarity and truth. And truth, in Egypt, was more than fact. It was the principle of cosmic order, justice, and balance. Every column of numbers in a tax register, every line of a legal contract, every record of grain shipments or temple offerings was an act of upholding Mayat. If he worked in a government office, he might walk along the edge of the city to a shaded courtyard, where rows of other scribes sat cross-legged on mats, writing quietly. Supervisors passed between them, checking for errors, collecting finished scrolls, assigning new tasks. Perhaps today he was to record a shipment of barley from Upper Egypt, or to copy a royal decree onto multiple tablets for provincial delivery. Perhaps he was helping a local official draft a marriage agreement, carefully noting the dowry, the property rights, the names of witnesses. Or perhaps he was copying poetry, hymns to Ra, or stories from the Book of the Dead, meant to be placed in tombs to guide souls safely through the afterlife. He did not rush. To write too quickly was to invite error, and errors in these matters could last for centuries. At midday, he might pause for bread and figs, for a small bowl of lentils or dates. He would eat in silence or soft conversation, wiping his hands clean before returning to the careful lines. The sun would arc slowly overhead, shadows would shift, the papyrus would crinkle slightly in the warmth. But still he wrote, still he focused, still he served the memory of Egypt. In the evening, as the sky turned soft and gold, he might return home, his scrolls stored safely, his ink pots cleaned and set aside. He might recite lines from ancient teachings. Writing is the mother of speakers, the father of knowledge. He might teach his son how to hold the pen just right, how to draw the first signs of the alphabet, how to read the stars of the sky like the lines of a scroll. He did not wear a crown. He did not carve his name into stone, but he carved ideas into time. And for every great monument that still stands today, there is a document that explains it, a scribe that recorded it, a brush that gave it life beyond stone. As you lie still now, breathing softly, imagine the quiet scratch of the reed on papyrus, the rustle of a scroll unrolling, the gentle weight of words taking form. The world of the scribe was not loud. It did not demand. It simply endured. As another quiet morning arrived on the banks of the Nile, the scribe returned to his daily duties, not out of obligation, but with a calm sense of rhythm, as though each day unfolded like a scroll being slowly unrolled. The light filtered in gently through the shutters, casting soft golden lines across the workspace, where small pots of pigment waited, lids off, brushes laid neatly on folded linen. There was no need for urgency. A scribe's task was to last beyond the day. His hand moved at the pace of thought, at the pace of breath, at the pace of memory. In ancient Egypt, scribes were not merely recorders of transactions. They were curators of order, maintainers of Mat, keepers of the structure that held society together. Without them, there would be no tax system, no agricultural records, no temple accounts, no inheritance contracts. Every field harvested, every jar counted, every name remembered passed at some point through the hands of a scribe. Today, perhaps he was assigned to sit at the edge of the granary, where officials weighed the offerings from nearby farms. Baskets of emmer wheat, jars of honey, bundles of flax. He would sit under a cloth canopy, legs crossed, papyrus stretched across a lapboard, eyes following the rhythm of the counters as they shouted amounts. He recorded what was received, what was owed, what had been taxed, and what would be stored for the dry season. His numerals, written in precise columns, were as much a part of the harvest as the grain itself. Later, he might visit the temple, entering through cool stone halls where incense hung in the air and silence wrapped around him like a curtain. Here, he would update inventories of ritual objects, amulets, oils, linen robes, and record the distribution of offerings: meat for the gods, beer for the priests, bread for the poor. He might also be asked to transcribe hymns onto fresh scrolls for recitation, writing in red ink for the divine names and black for the body of the text, his brush moving like a whisper across the page. He knew these prayers by heart, not just as words, but as rhythm, as music in silence. In other moments, his duties were less sacred, but no less important. A widow might come to the scribal house seeking help to write a letter to a family member far away. She would dictate slowly, emotionally, and the scribe would translate her spoken phrases into written form, choosing words carefully, respectfully, so that the tone was preserved. He might also be asked to copy older records, restoring faded documents by carefully rewriting each symbol with fidelity, preserving the voices of generations past. His life was not one of luxury, but it was one of deep trust. He moved freely in palaces and workshops, in courts and warehouses, respected by all levels of society. He carried no weapon, held no rank, but his reed brush was power. To be literate in a world where most were not was to hold a quiet kind of influence. And yet, it was not arrogance that guided him. It was discipline. Every mistake had consequence. A miswritten numeral could mean overtaxing a farmer. A misread date could disrupt an inheritance. And so he checked, and double-checked, and copied again if needed. His was a world of lines, of order, of stillness. When the workday ended, he might walk home slowly along the canal, passing fishermen hauling nets, children playing in the dust, merchants packing up their stalls. He might stop to buy fresh dates, or pause to wash his hands in cool water before stepping into his shaded home. There he would rest, eat a simple meal, and perhaps light a small oil lamp to review a scroll by its flickering glow. The evening breeze would drift through the window. Somewhere, someone would sing a lullaby, and in that stillness, the scribe would feel at peace, not because his work was done, but because his work had meaning. It connected people. It preserved truth. It flowed like the Nile itself, quiet and constant. As you rest here now, listening, imagine the feel of a reed brush between your fingers, the soft rasp of papyrus, the weight of words that must last. Let those images flow through you, like ink through water, slow, gentle, enduring. There were days when the scribe's duties extended beyond ink and papyrus, when he was called not only to record, but to observe, to bear quiet witness to the moments that defined life in the kingdom of the Nile. In a land where floods governed planting and harvest, where the stars marked sacred calendars, and where the balance of society depended on timely offerings and recorded exchanges, the scribe was more than a clerk. He was an interpreter of cycles, a translator of time. On some mornings, he would be summoned to the riverbank to note the height of the floodwaters measured against tall stone pillars carved with ancient marks. Standing in the gentle hum of insects, shaded by reeds, he would sketch the year's measure into official records, knowing that too little water meant drought, too much meant ruin, and just the right amount meant renewal. His handwriting would be passed to temple administrators, to granary keepers, and to local governors, each making their quiet decisions based on his quiet marks. On other days, he might be present at legal proceedings, small disputes between neighbors, inheritance cases, or contracts for labor and land. There was no raised voice, no pounding gavel, only a shaded veranda, a wooden tablet, and the calm presence of elders. The scribe sat near the edge of the group, legs folded, brush in hand, as each party spoke their part. He recorded with care, without judgment, ensuring that the final text captured the truth with clarity. Once approved, he would draw the seals, small ovals inscribed with the names of witnesses, pressed into clay and dried in the sun. These documents might outlive every voice in the room, stored in archives of mud brick buildings, wrapped in linen, waiting for distant eyes. The work required attention not only to language, but to people. The scribe learned to listen closely, to discern the meaning beneath tone, to measure words like weights on a balance. In a world where few could write, the scribe was trusted not just to record, but to interpret, to shape spoken thoughts into lasting form. He did not exaggerate, he did not abbreviate, For his role was not to create, but to clarify. And in doing so, he protected the dignity of those who came to him, rich or poor, young or old. In quieter moments, he might be alone, seated in a courtyard behind the temple, copying sacred texts for preservation. He would recite the words softly as he wrote them, letting their rhythm settle into his breath. These were not only lines of poetry, they were spells, songs, blessings. To the Egyptians, words had power. Spoken words invoked presence. Written words preserved it. A name carved on stone ensured memory. A name forgotten risked being lost to eternity. The scribe knew this deeply. It shaped how he wrote, how he lived. He was not seeking fame. He was ensuring continuity. Even his training reflected this patience. From childhood, a future scribe would spend years copying maxims, lists, moral sayings, learning not just script, but values. Be humble, one line might read. Do not speak when your knowledge is weak. Another might say, the reed pen is your servant. Feed it with thought. These phrases were more than practice. They were instruction for life. And so, by the time a young man earned the title of scribe, he had absorbed more than technique. He had absorbed a worldview, one that prized balance, detail, humility, and quiet excellence. As night returned to the desert and stars began to emerge, familiar, orderly, eternal, the scribe might sit outside for a moment longer, watching the sky. He would note the position of Sirius, the harbinger of the flood, or trace Orion as it walked the heavens. These stars, too, were records. These constellations, too, were scrolls. They spoke not in words but in light and distance. And the scribe, trained to read, listened with his eyes. As your body softens now and your breath falls into rhythm, imagine yourself under that same sky wrapped in linen, with a brush in hand and the world quietly waiting to be written. There is no urgency, only meaning, only movement, slow and sacred. Like ink across papyrus, like water down the Nile, like time, flowing forward. In the gentle passing of days along the Nile, the scribe's role extended into nearly every aspect of ancient Egyptian life, not through force or authority, but through quiet stewardship of words, numbers, and meaning. He was, in many ways, the memory of the state, the thread that connected the voice of the pharaoh to the hands of the farmer, the rules of the temple to the offerings of the faithful, the laws of the court to the fields beyond its walls. His world was filled not with noise but with symbols, carefully drawn, deeply understood, passed from generation to generation like secrets etched in ink. The tools he used were modest: a brush of split reed, a palette of black and red pigment, and sheets of papyrus made from the marsh plants that lined the sacred river. But with these, he recorded history, tallied resources, documented beliefs, and shaped the invisible architecture of the kingdom. Today, perhaps he was assigned to the House of Life, the Per-Ankh, a kind of library and school found near temples where sacred knowledge was preserved. There he might copy medical texts, lists of treatments, spells, and natural remedies passed down for centuries. He would write slowly, not only because each word mattered, but because some scrolls carried more than knowledge. They were believed to carry healing power. He might then transcribe legal codes, which were read aloud in public squares to ensure transparency, or genealogies of noble families, carefully tracing names through time to validate lineage and inheritance. His brush danced between administrative clarity and sacred reverence, treating each task with equal care. In the midday heat, the courtyard would fall quiet. He would sit beneath a palm awning, sipping water from a clay jar, watching the birds skimming the surface of the canal nearby. He might look out across the fields and see the farmers tending their crops, knowing that each plot was documented, measured, taxed, and recorded, often by him. Not out of control, but out of order, not to dominate, but to balance. Egypt prized harmony, and the scribe helped maintain it through quiet diligence. In the evening, he might be asked to record the results of a harvest, sitting with village elders and priests as they listed the produce yielded: wheat, onions, grapes, flax. He would nod and write, each mark representing a real thing: a bushel, a jar, a tool, a life. Later, he would review temple inventories, list repair needs, note which statues needed cleaning, which scrolls needed restoring, which offerings had been accepted. There was something comforting in the repetition. The same forms, the same measures, the same care. It was not a task for those who craved change, but for those who found peace in patterns. And this peace extended into his personal life. In his home, small but tidy, scrolls were stored in clay jars, tools were wrapped in linen, and wisdom was passed on with quiet ceremony. Perhaps his son was learning now, just as he once did, copying from wooden tablets, drawing lines, memorizing sayings. A scribe in the house of instruction is as a gardener in the house of growth, the boy would recite. The father would correct gently, then nod with pride. There were no grand celebrations, no parades for the scribes, but their names, when recorded, lasted longer than kings. Their words, etched into tomb walls and temple pillars, became the voice of eternity. They helped the dead speak again. They guided the living toward justice. They carried the thoughts of a civilization across millennia. As you settle into stillness now, imagine holding a scroll still warm from the sun. Imagine dipping a reed into ink made of soot and memory. Imagine the feel of smooth papyrus under your hand, and the quiet knowledge that what you write may one day outlast stone. There is no rush. There is only care. There is only rhythm. There is only the soft, enduring presence of the scribe, sitting cross-legged in the shade of time, writing the breath of a people into history. As the sky above ancient Egypt deepened from soft gold to quiet blue, and the desert wind grew cooler with the approach of evening, the scribe set aside his tools for the day. His hands, steady and stained with traces of ink, carefully wrapped the scrolls he had completed and placed them inside clay jars or linen bundles, tucking them into a niche in the wall or a box carved from sycamore wood. The ink palettes were rinsed, the brushes trimmed, the water pot sealed for tomorrow. Everything returned to its place, not out of habit, but out of reverence. For the scribe knew that what he had written that day might be read not just in a month or a year, but in generations to come. He moved through his tasks with the same calm awareness that guided his pen, slow, precise, without waste. The light in his home came not from fire, but from a single flickering oil lamp, fed with castor oil, casting shadows that wavered gently against the mud brick walls. Perhaps he read from one of the scrolls in his collection, wisdom literature passed down through centuries, filled with teachings on humility, patience, and truth. Be diligent, it might say. Let your heart be in your writings, for thus your name will live forever. And he would nod, not proudly, but knowingly, as someone who understood that immortality in Egypt was not measured by monuments, but by memory. To be remembered was to continue. To be recorded was to endure. The scribe's work, though unseen by the crowds, became part of the eternal. Every ledger of harvests, every marriage record, every hymn to the gods gave shape to the society that surrounded him. Without him, no one could track tribute, no one could transmit teachings, no one could anchor the present to the past. His words stitched time together, thread by thread, scroll by scroll. Even as war or famine occasionally swept through, even as kings rose and fell, the scribes kept writing. In palaces and temples, in tax offices and schools, they preserved the rhythms of life. There were thousands of them across Egypt's history, some celebrated in tomb inscriptions, many more anonymous, but each one contributed to a collective voice, steady and calm, that still speaks from the walls of ruins and the lines of recovered papyri. To study Egypt today is to listen to those voices. To walk through an ancient temple is to see their work etched into stone. To open a museum case and gaze upon a faded scroll is to witness the breath of a scribe from 3,000 years ago. His hand, his mind, his moment of focus, frozen in ink. That is the quiet legacy of his life. Not power, not wealth, but presence. A soft, continuous presence that flows like the Nile, shaping the land not with floods, but with gentle nourishment. And though his name may be forgotten, the effect of his work lingers, seen in every piece of preserved text, in every column of careful hieroglyphs, in every stone inscription carved first by brush. As you drift into sleep now, let your mind wander into that world once more. Hear the rustle of papyrus as it's unrolled. Feel the warmth of the afternoon sun on smooth stone. Smell the dry ink and the gentle earthiness of the scribe's chamber. There is no rush, only rhythm, only purpose, only the slow and sacred act of writing what must be remembered. like water carried in a clay jar, like stars carved into a ceiling of blue, like footsteps recorded in the sand. The scribe is not in the spotlight, but he is always there, in the margins, in the archives, in the future. And now, as your body rests and your thoughts begin to fade, let the scribe's steady breath become your own. Let his calm be your calm. Let the wisdom of his silence carry you gently through the night. You have read enough, you have written enough, you have remembered, and that is enough. In the gentle cadence of ancient Egyptian life, the world of the scribe continued to unfold with the quiet depth of routine, repetition, and reverence. As each new day emerged over the low eastern horizon and the Nile shimmered in soft morning light, the scribe returned once more to his tools. Not with haste, but with the understanding that through these quiet hours, the entire rhythm of the kingdom found its voice. There was no ceremony in his movements, only method. He dipped his brush into black ink, then red, alternating as needed. Each pigment made by hand from soot or earth, mixed with water, stored in shallow wells on a flat wooden pallet. The brush itself, cut from river reeds, was chewed slightly at the tip for softness, then shaped into a point. Simple, practical, delicate. With this modest instrument, he gave structure to the world. Today's work might begin with reviewing ledgers from the royal granary, tallies of wheat and barley transported along canals in papyrus boats. Each shipment was carefully tracked, origin, weight, destination, all part of a delicate balance between harvest and consumption. The scribe's role in this was not managerial, but preservational. His ink preserved reality. His brush froze time. In his scrolls, the empire stayed in harmony. Later in the day, he might join a procession of temple administrators, inspecting offerings and ritual materials. As the group walked through massive columns in the temple's inner courtyard, incense swirling around them, sacred chants reverberating against stone, the scribe remained just a step behind, head bowed slightly, scroll in hand. He would note how many jars of oil had arrived, how much linen was left for wrapping statues, which foods had spoiled or been consumed. Each entry was made with care, not just for the gods, but for the people who depended on accurate records for the rituals to remain in rhythm. Without records, the rituals could not be timed. Without timing, Ma'at, the sacred balance, might falter. In the afternoon, seated beneath a shaded portico or inside a cool chamber, he might return to a longer task, perhaps copying a revered scroll for a noble household, or writing funerary texts, commissioned by a family preparing for a loved one's burial. These texts, drawn from the Book of the Dead or other sacred writings, were not mere literature. They were guides for the soul's journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Each symbol had protective power. Each phrase carried spiritual meaning. A misplaced character could change the direction of a soul. The scribe approached such work with quiet solemnity, aware that the words he traced today might be placed in a tomb tomorrow, resting beside a mummified body for all eternity. And while others prayed or wept, he worked, not coldly, but steadily, letting his skills serve the sacred. His own thoughts wandered gently as he worked. He might recall his own teachers, the stern but patient elders who taught him to write on potsherds and wooden tablets, repeating phrases until his wrist knew the rhythm of the brush by muscle memory. He might wonder about the students now beginning their own journeys, sitting in open courtyards repeating lines aloud. The scribe is greater than the man with the plow, and he would feel a quiet pride. Not pride in superiority, but in continuity, in being part of a lineage not of blood, but of ink. When the day's scrolls were finished, he would store them in reed baskets or ceramic jars sealed with mud, label them with care, and mark the date using the reigning pharaoh's regnal year. Year 14 of the reign of the Horus mighty bull, son of Ra, and so on. This dating system connected every record to the wider cycle of time, placing each small act within the frame of history. It was not about bureaucracy, it was about belonging. As night approached, the sounds of the city would soften. The creak of carts, the murmur of markets, the soft singing of workers along the river, all faded into stillness. And the scribe, his duties complete, would sit by the doorway of his home, watching the stars return. In Egypt, stars were not only lights, they were deities, they were guardians, they were stories. And the scribe, whose life was shaped by stories, felt at home among them. As your own breath slows now and your body relaxes into the stillness of sleep, imagine that sky above the Nile, dark and endless, dotted with constellations once traced by priest astronomers and written down by scribes just like him. Let their soft light guide you into dreams, where nothing rushes and everything has meaning. As another day unfolded over the fertile banks of the Nile, the scribe's presence, though quiet, remained central to the intricate machinery of ancient Egyptian life. Unlike soldiers who marched or priests who chanted, the scribe worked in the margins. Yet it was in those very margins that meaning took root. His work today began at the local records house, a small structure built of sun-dried brick, where scrolls were stacked inside niches and clay labels hung from twine marked their contents. These were not libraries in the modern sense, but more like living memory banks of the community. Some scrolls documented land ownership, passed down through generations. Others listed annual yields, births, marriages, and deaths. A few detailed legal disputes, boundary arguments, missing tools, broken agreements. All needed updating, all needed preserving. And so the scribe, with no flourish, no audience, began his day. He examined a tax record from the previous month and compared it with new figures brought in by a local collector. Sacks of emmer wheat, bundles of flax, tallies of livestock. These were translated into measures and written down with precision. Not a single glyph was rushed. Accuracy was more than a professional standard. It was a sacred duty. The scribe knew that one miswritten number could mean unfair burden for a farmer, or loss for the temple. He worked slowly, with reverence. Outside, the midday heat thickened. Dust floated lazily in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through the lattice windows. The low hum of life in the village continued. Potters shaping jars, weavers working looms, children chasing one another barefoot through the streets. The scribe remained at his post, unfazed by the sounds, shielded by habit and focus. Occasionally, a temple official would step in, bringing new updates, an inventory of linens donated by a noblewoman, or a request to record a local blessing ceremony held at the riverbank. The scribe noted it all. He did not ask why. His job was not to judge, but to preserve. In this way, he became a mirror of society, reflecting its rhythms without interfering, chronicling its triumphs and missteps alike. Later, he moved to the schoolhouse nearby, a rectangular courtyard shaded by wooden beams. Here, younger students practiced their letters on clay tablets, repeating lines in soft, rhythmic tones. The scribe, now a teacher for the afternoon, walked between them. He corrected posture, adjusted the way a brush was held, reminded them to leave proper spacing between signs. "A crooked hand makes a crooked word," he would say gently, echoing his own master from decades ago. Some boys struggled with curves, others forgot the order of determinatives, but all were trying. And that was enough. Occasionally, he would take a student's hand in his and guide it, not to show superiority, but to offer rhythm. Writing, after all, was not just a mental act. It was physical. It was a gesture of the body as much as of the mind. As the sun dipped westward, the scribe returned home with a sense of quiet satisfaction. His day had passed like many others, without spectacle, without applause, but with meaning layered in every mark he made. At home, his wife prepared lentils and bread. His children played with carved wooden animals in the courtyard. He sat beneath a fig tree, brushing dust from his robes, then gently unrolled a scroll, not to work, but to read. Perhaps it was a teaching of Ptahhotep or a hymn to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. The words flowed gently before him, like water in a shallow stream, their meanings deeper with age. These were the same lines he had copied as a boy, and now, as an elder, they comforted him. In them, he found not just knowledge but peace, the quiet that follows duty well done, the assurance that something so small, a symbol, a word, a line, could last, could guide, could endure. As night crept in and stars blinked into place above the river's edge, the scribe closed the scroll, extinguished the lamp, and listened to the hush of the village settling to sleep. In the stillness, he felt the presence of time, not as a weight, but as a companion. He had served it today, as he would again tomorrow. And as you lie here now, breathing slowly, let that same stillness wrap around you. Let the rhythm of ink and breath and memory carry you deeper into rest. You do not need to write anything. You do not need to remember. You only need to feel the quiet, the kind the scribe felt each night, and let it hold you gently as sleep begins to settle in. As dawn stretched softly over the village rooftops and the Nile stirred with the first quiet paddles of fishermen's boats, the scribe awoke with a familiar stillness. There was no rush to his mornings, no need for alarms or calls. His body, trained by years of habit and sun, responded to the gentle light that filtered through the woven reed screen of his sleeping chamber. He rose, wrapped in a simple linen tunic, and stepped into the cool morning air. The day's work lay ahead, not as burden, but as rhythm. In the courtyard, a clay basin held water from the night before. He washed his face, ran wet fingers through his hair, and whispered a prayer, not spoken aloud, but shaped in the mind, to Thoth, the divine patron of scribes. It was not a prayer for success, but for clarity, for steadiness of hand, for purity of thought. Then, with his scroll case and writing tools, wrapped carefully in a cloth bundle, he made his way toward the temple district. There, among tall columns and painted walls, he would serve once more as the quiet bridge between speech and record, between ritual and permanence. That morning, a ceremony had been planned in honor of the local deity. Offerings of grain, figs, wine, and incense laid upon stone altars. Priests in white linen moved with slow choreography, their voices rising in low chants, punctuated by the clang of sistrums. The scribe stood to the side, as always, brush in hand, noting the time, the number of offerings, the names of donors, and the sequence of hymns sung. His scroll grew gradually with careful lines, red ink for headings, black for the body of text. He did not pause for conversation. He did not question what was performed. His role was not to interpret, but to preserve. It was through his writing that the ritual would be remembered, not just today, but perhaps a century from now, should the scroll survive. Once the incense had faded and the offerings had been taken away, he followed the priests into the temple's inner hall, where a carved niche held the sacred image of the god. There, behind closed doors, they recorded private matters, donations from nobles, repairs needed on the temple roof, requests for divine intercession. The scribe copied these onto official scrolls, his strokes swift but never careless. Each word became a thread in a fabric woven across years. Without his records, promises could be forgotten, disputes could arise, offerings could go missing. But with his writing, the temple remained steady, like a boat balanced by a skilled helmsman. At midday, the scribe found shade in a small side chamber and shared a meal with a fellow scribe, flatbread, dried dates, and cool water from a clay jar. Their conversation was brief, quiet, respectful. They spoke of a newly recovered scroll from a collapsed granary wall, its text still legible. They discussed a rare hieroglyph variant that had puzzled a student. They laughed gently at a young novice who had accidentally written cat instead of king in a funerary dedication. There was no competition between them, only craft, only care. After the meal, he resumed work, not on temple matters, but on a private commission. A wealthy artisan had asked for a scroll to be copied, an ancient tale from the Middle Kingdom, rich with metaphor and wisdom. The scribe sat in silence, eyes tracing the old lines, hand replicating them onto new papyrus. The scroll spoke of humility, of patience, of fate. It warned against pride, praised listening, and reminded the reader that even kings fall if their hearts grow deaf. As he copied each line, the scribe did not merely transcribe the words, he absorbed them. They became part of him, shaping his thoughts as much as his letters shaped the page. Evening brought a hush to the temple grounds. The priests departed. The sun cast long shadows through the open courtyards, and the scribe, his scrolls complete, wrapped his tools and made his way home. Along the path, he passed farmers returning from the fields, their baskets heavy with onions and barley. He nodded politely, and they greeted him with quiet respect. For though he held no weapon, no staff of office, they knew his work touched every part of their lives, from land deeds to prayer texts, from birth records to taxes. He was not just a man of words, he was a keeper of the kingdom's memory. And so, as he crossed the threshold of his home and settled beside the low fire where his children listened wide-eyed to stories from their mother, the scribe smiled. Not because of recognition or reward, but because in his quiet labor, he had helped carry forward the very breath of Egypt. As the stars began their patient climb across the night sky and your breath grows slow, imagine that quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from a day well lived, a line well drawn, a thought captured forever in ink. And let that same stillness carry you gently toward sleep. In the final stretch of the scribe's long day, there existed a kind of stillness that most others in the city never truly touched. A stillness not born of fatigue, but of devotion to precision and the comfort of familiarity. As twilight gathered over the Nile and lanterns flickered in quiet doorways, the scribe remained in his modest chamber, bent over a scroll that required delicate correction. The papyrus sheet before him was not new. It bore traces of old ink, faded and smeared, a document rescued from a collapsed storeroom belonging to a merchant family. The family had pleaded with him to restore it, not because of monetary value, but because the scroll contained generations of names, births, inheritances, small disputes, reconciliations, an intimate archive of a household's quiet journey through time. With a wetted brush and meticulous care, he traced over the faint lines, matching their form exactly, coaxing each faded character back into legibility, as if waking it gently from sleep. Each name he restored felt like a whisper from the past, a breath returned to those long gone. He paused often, not to rest, but to listen, not to the sounds of the street outside, but to the inner cadence of the scroll itself, as if the very ink carried memory. This kind of work could not be rushed. It was a slow conversation with time. Once finished, he set the scroll aside and reached for another, a request from the temple to translate a rare astronomical hymn into more common script for wider recitation. The original had been carved into stone in the high halls of a sanctuary far upriver, too elaborate for the average temple singer to follow. His task was to render it into something clear but sacred, accurate but flowing. As he worked, he found himself humming the rhythm of the lines. The stars speak in silence, and the moon watches with patience. The words, though ancient, felt present. To the scribe, each syllable was more than symbol. It was sound, motion, meaning. It was not unlike composing music, though no harp was needed. The harmony came from balance on the page, the measured space between words, the shape of the brush's stroke. Outside, the night deepened, and the household quieted. His wife had gone to rest. The children curled on mats with dreams of crocodiles, date palms, and lotus ponds. But the scribe remained a little longer. His small oil lamp, carefully trimmed, cast a flickering pool of light across the scrolls, illuminating his lined face and calloused fingers. This was the part of the day he never spoke of, the hours when the world was asleep and he was alone with thoughts too subtle for daylight. He sometimes wondered whether the gods themselves ever read the things he wrote, whether Thoth, in some celestial library, kept copies of his work. He imagined a vast chamber of stars, lined with glowing scrolls, the breath of 1,000 scribes stored for eternity. Such thoughts did not frighten him, they comforted him. For a scribe, legacy did not live in monuments or loud declarations. It lived in lines of ink that survived flood and fire, in names remembered long after the bodies were gone. His own name, he suspected, would one day fade, but his words might not. And in that quiet truth, he found peace. At last, when the lamp sputtered low, he rose and stretched, his bones stiff, but his spirit calm. He placed the scrolls in their proper baskets, covered his inks, wiped the reed brushes with a damp cloth, and closed the shutters. As he lay down beside the cooling embers of the hearth, he let out a soft sigh, not of weariness, but of completion. Another day in the long line of days, another link in the chain of memory. And now, as your eyes grow heavier and your breathing slower, think of that quiet room, lit by oil and filled with the soft scent of ink and old papyrus. Think of the scribe, whose hands made no noise, but whose legacy echoed across centuries. Let that image guide you into dreams. As you drift further into the hush of night, held by the same silence that held him. As dawn once again painted the horizon in hues of soft gold and pale blue, the scribe stirred from his modest bed, not with urgency, but with a quiet, practiced grace. The days had begun to blur into one another, not because of forgetfulness, but because of rhythm, a life so deeply entrenched in steady cycles that each morning felt like a familiar page turning in a scroll. He rose slowly, greeted the morning light with a silent nod, and stepped barefoot onto the worn clay floor of his courtyard, where the scent of fig trees and warm dust filled the air. Today, like the many days before it, he would serve not only his temple and his town, but the unseen thread of continuity that wound through the ages. He gathered his tools with care, his papyrus scrolls bundled with linen cloth, his reed pens sharpened and soaked overnight, and the inks he had ground by hand, one for red headings and one for black text. Each object was familiar, but never taken for granted. They were his companions, his voice, his instruments of preservation. His first stop was the small village office, where a visiting inspector from the district capital required assistance. The man had brought with him a ledger in disarray, poorly written names, unclear dates, misaligned entries, and now looked to the village scribe to restore order to the chaos. Without judgment, without comment, the scribe set to work. Line by line, he rewrote the document, correcting spelling, standardizing measurements, and adding missing determinatives. His fingers moved deliberately, each motion like the steady tick of a sundial. The inspector, at first anxious, gradually relaxed in the scribe's presence, lulled by the quiet confidence in his work. By midday, the scroll had been transformed, now a clear and legible record, ready for archiving. The scribe accepted a nod of thanks and moved on, not lingering, not boasting. In the afternoon, a grieving family came to him, bearing the name of a relative who had passed. They asked for a proper death notice to be written, something to be buried with the body and offered to the gods. The scribe listened carefully as they described the man's life, his trade, his kindness, his favorite fruit, his quiet love for music. The scribe took these details and, with gentle words, composed a passage for the afterlife, a blend of tribute, instruction, and prayer. He did not invent, but elevated. He shaped memory into meaning. The family wept softly as they read his words, not from sadness alone, but from the comfort of having their grief acknowledged in a form that would endure. As the evening drew near and shadows stretched across the village like long fingers of the setting sun, the scribe took one final scroll from his satchel. This one was for himself. It was not a record, not a commission, not even a teaching tool. It was a blank scroll, one he had kept for months, waiting for the right moment. Tonight, he would begin to write his own reflection, not an autobiography in the modern sense, but a meditation, a collection of lessons, thoughts, and images gathered from years of quiet labor. He began slowly, carefully, as always. To write, he penned, is not to speak loudly, but to listen deeply. It is to take the breath of a moment and press it into time. He continued, I have written kings into memory and farmers into truth. I have captured the shape of wind, the weight of sorrow, the joy of birth, and the finality of death. Not because I was told to, but because someone must remember. His hand did not tremble. His brush did not slip. There was a certainty in his stroke, as if each line had been waiting to be born. He wrote until the oil lamp burned low, until the crickets sang outside, until the village had long since settled into dreams. Then he rolled the scroll gently, tied it with cord, and placed it in a clay jar beside his others. It was not labeled. It did not need to be. He knew that if the jar were ever found centuries from now, if the scroll survived flood, flame, and time, someone would read it and know. As he lay down that night, the breeze carrying in the faint scent of the river, the scribe closed his eyes not with weariness, but with peace. He had served language. He had served memory. And now, as you lie still, wrapped in your own quiet, know that this story too has been carefully recorded, not with pen, but with voice. A voice that now falls silent, so that your own mind may wander into rest. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts soften. Let the ink dry, and drift gently into sleep. That brings our previous story to a quiet close. Before we begin the next gentle journey, if this helped you drift closer to rest, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing for more calm stories like this one. Now, let's continue our Boring History for Sleep series and ease into tonight's next tale, how the Indus Valley people built their cities. Long before the sweeping marble columns of Rome or the limestone pyramids of Giza had captured the world's attention, there existed a quiet civilization along the banks of the Indus River, in what is now modern-day Pakistan and northwest India. Here, among dry plains and winding tributaries, a people built cities, slowly, methodically, without spectacle, yet with a precision and order that still puzzles scholars today. These were not cities of conquest or towering statues. They were cities of clay bricks, water drains, straight roads, and quiet logic. Their names echo faintly through time: Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, but the voices behind them have long since faded. There are no great kings remembered from this civilization, no epic battles carved into stone, no grand declarations of empire. Instead, there are bricks, millions of them, uniform in size, made from baked mud, laid in perfect alignment. It begins with a grid, not the kind that appears by accident, but one designed with intention. Streets run north to south, east to west. They intersect at right angles. The cities do not sprawl or spiral. They are measured, balanced, as though drawn by an invisible hand with a ruler and a vision. This order is not a product of monarchy or command. There is no evidence of palaces, no sign of a central throne. And yet the planning is undeniable. Some suggest it may have emerged from shared custom, from communal understanding passed down generation to generation. A tradition not shouted from rooftops but built into the very clay of daily life. At the heart of each city is not a monument but a system. Beneath the streets lies a network of covered drains, brick-lined, sloped for gravity to carry waste away, each segment linked to houses and public wells. These drains speak not of extravagance, but of care, of a society that valued cleanliness, order, and health. No other ancient civilization created such consistent urban sanitation so early. Above ground, houses cluster in blocks. They face inward onto courtyards, protecting families from the sun and dust. Some homes are modest, a few rooms around a central open space. Others are larger, 2 stories, with staircases and private wells. The bricks, always the same dimensions, suggest standard molds and shared construction methods. Even the tools used for measurement, small carved stones and standardized units, show a respect for precision that seems at odds with the silence these people left behind. There are no sweeping texts or inscribed histories. Their writing, etched into seals and tablets, remains undeciphered. Hundreds of tiny signs, sharp, elegant, mysterious, line the edges of soapstone and terracotta, but no one today can read them. Still, the script hints at commerce, at record-keeping, perhaps even prayer. It is a script made not to boast, but to function. At the center of Mohenjo-daro lies a large public bath, a rectangular basin lined with bricks, sealed with bitumen to hold water. Steps lead into it on all sides. It is not a reservoir. It is too carefully designed. This may have been a place of ritual cleansing, of quiet ceremony, of community. Around it are changing rooms and platforms, suggesting organized use. Here, in the dry heat, water was made sacred, and in every neighborhood, wells. Dozens of them, sunk deep, ringed with baked bricks. Some are public, others private. Water did not need to be fetched from rivers. It was brought to the people. This too suggests thought, planning, consideration, not only for the present, but for generations. This was not the architecture of ego. It was the architecture of endurance. As night falls on the Indus plains and your eyes grow heavier, imagine a city lit by oil lamps, not torches of war. Imagine the soft sound of water moving through a clay pipe, the quiet hum of life moving along straight roads, the cool of a courtyard shaded by mud brick walls. Here, in these silent cities, thousands lived, not loudly, not triumphantly, but peacefully, and as you drift into sleep, know that sometimes the greatest civilizations are not the ones that make the most noise, but the ones that build, and keep building brick by brick for those yet to come. As the early morning sun climbed slowly over the rooftops of the Indus Valley cities, it warmed the flat brick surfaces and cast soft shadows along the streets that had been laid centuries before with geometric precision. The day began not with bells or declarations, but with the steady rhythm of daily life, a rhythm etched into the design of every block, every courtyard, every rooftop stair. In a house facing east, a woman might rise and sweep the floor of her home with a bundle of reeds, her movements practiced, her mind calm. Outside, the streets were quiet. lined with low walls and evenly spaced doorways, all constructed from the same baked clay bricks, each molded to identical dimensions. The uniformity of these bricks is more than aesthetic. It points to a system, a knowledge passed between builders, from generation to generation. Somewhere, a man knelt beside a well, lowering a clay pot slowly into the water, his hands worn from repetition but steady. These wells, some of which still exist, dot the urban landscape, placed with a kind of intentional generosity that suggests a society built on shared access rather than strict control. A short walk from his home might take him past a neighborhood drain, its stone cover slightly raised for inspection or cleaning, reminding passers-by that even the unseen elements of their city had been planned with care. The drainage systems were perhaps the most advanced aspect of Indus urban planning, operating with such efficiency that their sophistication would not be matched in many parts of the world for thousands of years. Wastewater was guided away from homes and public areas through sloped channels that relied on gravity, not pumps, lined with bricks sealed with a material we now believe to be an early form of waterproof plaster. Not only were these systems highly functional, they were also integrated into the architecture, suggesting that sanitation was not an afterthought, but a central concern in the design of the city. By midday, the streets would be active, not with markets loud and bustling, but with traders and artisans conducting quiet exchanges, many using small square seals carved with animals, symbols, and what may have been names. These seals, typically made from steatite, were used to stamp impressions into soft clay, likely marking ownership or origin. One might show a humped bull, another a unicorn-like creature, another a series of lines and loops that remain unreadable to us today. Though undeciphered, these symbols suggest a system of identification, perhaps even a script, that was known and shared by merchants, scribes, and officials alike. In workshops near the city's edge, craftsmen worked in long-established patterns. Beadmakers drilled tiny holes through carnelian stones, potters shaped bowls with coils of red clay, and metalworkers cast bronze into tools and small decorative objects. These were not primitive artisans. The uniformity and symmetry of their work implies the use of standardized molds and tools, and the variety of materials, shells from the coast, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from the east, points to a wide-ranging trade network. The cities of the Indus Valley were not isolated. They communicated, they exchanged, they adapted. And yet, throughout all of this quiet commerce and industry, there remains a striking absence of hierarchy. No towering palaces, no oversized tombs, no grand temples designed to awe the masses. The granaries are large, yes, but functional. The central buildings are not ornate, but efficient. Even the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, so carefully constructed, shows no signs of exclusivity. It may have been used for ritual, but it does not dominate the city like a monument to power. This lack of obvious rulers does not imply disorder. It implies something else entirely. Perhaps a system based on consensus, on local governance, or a deeply rooted cultural norm of shared responsibility. We cannot say for certain, but the silence of kings in these ruins speaks volumes. As dusk begins to settle once again across the long-forgotten plains, the light fades on streets still aligned with the stars. The breeze carries the scent of earth and time. And as you lie still now, imagining those soft footfalls on ancient brick roads, the gentle drip of well water, the rustle of reeds in the evening air, know that the people of the Indus Valley built not for glory, but for harmony, not for dominance, but for durability. And as you drift further into sleep, let the quiet elegance of their cities guide you gently into rest. In the middle of an ordinary day in the city of Harappa, a traveler might have wandered down one of its broad, straight avenues, listening not to the shouts of merchants or the clang of chariots, but to the soft sound of sandals against baked earth and the occasional murmur of conversation. The streets, unusually wide for their time, were not chaotic or narrow like many early settlements. Instead, they formed neat corridors between buildings that stood quietly, facing the sun with uniform dignity. There were no grand arches or towering monuments, only rows of brick homes that hinted at thoughtful balance rather than hierarchy. These bricks, each one crafted to a consistent 1:4 ratio in dimension, formed the skeleton of the city. Their uniformity wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It represented a shared method, a common architectural language spoken across hundreds of miles, from Mohenjo-Daro in the south to Rakigarhi in the east. This consistency suggested an understanding that went beyond local custom. It suggested cultural cohesion, even without a central ruler. Workers, likely trained within families or small guilds, would have spent hours mixing mud, shaping it into wooden molds, drying it under the sun, and firing it in kilns. The resulting bricks were durable, stackable, and ready to become homes, wells, walls, and workshops. The placement of these homes followed careful alignment. The cities were oriented along cardinal directions, with streets and alleyways intersecting like a lattice. The homes often had thick walls to insulate against heat, small high windows for ventilation, and sometimes even second stories with staircases built into inner courtyards. Each design choice, though simple, showed a depth of understanding about climate and community needs. Inside, rooms were often arranged around central spaces, with niches in the walls for storage and simple clay hearths for cooking. Some houses had dedicated bathing rooms with brick floors sloped gently toward drains, connected to the broader sanitation system beneath the streets. This sense of integration, of private life flowing seamlessly into public infrastructure, speaks volumes about the planning that went into even the most mundane corners of these cities. And this planning was not only spatial, but temporal. Evidence suggests that these cities were not built in haste, but evolved gradually. Layers of construction, occupation, and renovation show that homes were rebuilt over time in the same locations, often with care to maintain the original structure and alignment. This continuity hints at generational knowledge being passed down, with techniques and standards preserved across centuries. Even public buildings, such as the so-called granaries, were likely multifunctional spaces. Raised platforms with air-ventilated floors may have been used to store grain, but they could also have served as market depots or administrative hubs. What they lack in decorative flourish, they make up for in utility and durability. And surrounding these buildings, wide courtyards suggest gatherings, exchanges, perhaps even quiet ceremonies that left no trace except the enduring brick beneath. As the day wore on, artisans and traders would return from their tasks. Some may have brought shells from distant shores, others semi-precious stones from the highlands, and still others ingots of copper from lands far beyond the desert. These goods, moved by cart or carried by hand, passed through well-known routes and nodal cities. The Indus Valley was not just self-contained, it was part of a wider world, connected through trade that left faint but unmistakable echoes in the form of weights, measures, and seals. One such seal, carved with a figure seated in a yogic pose surrounded by animals, still sparks debate today. Is it a deity, a symbolic figure, a meditation? Its presence among items of daily use hints at a culture where the sacred and the mundane coexisted without spectacle. No temples have yet been found in these cities, no pyramids or ziggurats reaching into the sky. And yet the care in layout, the attention to sanitation, and the symbolism in artwork suggest a deeply spiritual people, whose beliefs may have been integrated quietly into life, rather than elevated atop a staircase to heaven. As twilight settled once more on the edge of the Indus River, a soft glow might emerge from the homes of the scribes, the bead makers, the mothers preparing lentils in clay pots, and the children playing near the open courtyards. No one voice was louder than another. No one home loomed above the rest. And perhaps it is this balance, this architectural humility, that allowed the Indus cities to endure for so long. Now, as you lie in stillness, let your thoughts drift through the ordered streets and shaded walkways of this vanished world. Feel the softness of clay beneath your feet, the quiet pride in a home well built, and the peace of a civilization that found strength not in spectacle, but in structure. And let that peace guide you gently into sleep. As dawn painted a pale shimmer across the rooftops of Mohenjo-Daro, the city stirred not with commotion, but with the soft rhythm of routine. In one quiet alleyway, the day began with the gentle creak of a wooden door swinging open, revealing a small courtyard where morning light filtered between high mud brick walls. In the center, a woman ladled water from her private well, splashing it across smooth stone tiles to cool the space before the sun grew strong. This courtyard, like many in the city, was a private sanctuary, shielded from the dust of the streets and arranged for both utility and comfort. The layout of these homes wasn't random. Builders understood airflow, sunlight angles, and the need for privacy within a dense urban layout. Some courtyards featured trees or small gardens, others merely a single pot of herbs near a cooking platform. The homes themselves, while modest by today's standards, reflected thoughtful design. High walls for insulation, small recessed shelves carved into the plaster, and niches for oil lamps. Yet what fascinates most archaeologists is not the beauty or variety of these structures, but their consistency. Across the civilization, over hundreds of miles, homes adhered to similar proportions, construction methods, and spatial logic. This suggests a shared system of education or training among builders. It also hints at cultural values deeply embedded in architecture, passed down not through decrees, but by hand and habit. Outside the homes, the city pulsed gently with life. Carts laden with grain moved slowly through main roads, their wooden wheels groaning under the weight. At intersections, small platforms allowed goods to be exchanged without blocking traffic. These platforms may have served as makeshift stalls or resting spots for traders. There were no permanent market squares, no towering marketplaces. Instead, commerce unfolded where space allowed, perhaps organized through oral agreements or communal memory. We do not find signs or price tags, only smooth worn thresholds and scattered remains of beads, shells, and broken pots. These traces whisper of transactions now long forgotten, exchanges made with quiet nods and simple tools. In one sector of the city, artisans gathered in workshops that may have functioned like guild districts. Here, stonecutters shaped ornaments from semi-precious stones. Bead makers drilled impossibly fine holes using bow drills tipped with copper. The level of craftsmanship was remarkable, not primitive but precise. Archaeologists have found entire trays of graduated weights made of chert, suggesting not just a sense of value, but a system of fairness. These weights conform to binary systems, 2, 4, 8, mirroring later numerical logic seen in distant regions. Such details suggest a trading culture that valued consistency and clarity. Even though the script of the Indus remains undeciphered, the weights and measures tell their own story. A society that conducted business with care. Near the workshop areas, a steady stream of people would have walked toward community wells. These wells, lined with concentric rings of perfectly placed bricks, served as gathering places and lifelines. Women may have shared news while filling jars. Children, curious and barefoot, may have peeked over the edge to listen to the cool echo of water below. This image repeats across city after city. The act of gathering water becomes not just necessity, but routine. And these routines build rhythm, one that knits a city together without central command. As the sun reached its peak, the city grew still. The brick streets, baked hot by the noonday sun, shimmered slightly in the heat. Life retreated indoors, where thick walls offered relief from the glare. In these silent hours, the design of the city showed its wisdom. Homes arranged for ventilation kept air moving. Courtyards offered shade and coolness. Even the rooftop terraces, accessible by brick staircases, may have provided breezy retreats. As the afternoon wore on, soft winds began to rise from the river. Traders returned from journeys, some having traveled to distant lands, across deserts, through forested hills, along dry, seasonal rivers that once carried boats. Goods from Mesopotamia, etched tablets, decorated pottery, have been found in Indus sites, and vice versa. These people were not isolated. They were part of an ancient web of exchange, maintained not through conquest, but through consistency and mutual need. And yet, unlike many contemporaries, the Indus cities leave behind no stories of kings or conquests. There are no murals of battle, no boasts carved in stone. What remains instead are bricks, drains, beads, and order, a kind of architectural humility that speaks not of glory, but of peace. As the evening settled again, families lit small oil lamps and prepared meals from lentils, barley, and seasonal vegetables. The smoke curled gently toward the sky, mixing with the scent of damp clay and river breeze. Somewhere, a pot cracked slightly in the fire, a reminder of the daily work still ahead. And so, the day ended as it began, in quiet rhythm, in simple design, in lasting structure. As your eyes begin to grow heavy, let your breath slow to match the calm of these cities. Let the warmth of the evening lamps and the gentle silence of a well-planned street cradle you into rest. As the moon cast its gentle glow over the rooftops of Mohenjo-Daro, a hush settled across the city, soft and serene. The narrow lanes that had earlier echoed faint footsteps were now empty, save for the occasional whisper of wind that curled between mud-brick walls. It was in this silence that the city's deeper harmony could be felt, an invisible design not just of space and stone, but of rhythm and time. The Indus Valley people, though long gone, left behind more than artifacts. They left behind a kind of urban melody, built into the repetition of bricks, the curves of drains, the alignment of homes. To the outside eye, these may seem like dry details, but under quiet observation, they reveal a world meticulously arranged, not by accident nor by force, but by centuries of patient thought. Let us consider the city's drainage once more, not as a structure, but as a philosophy. Every house, no matter how small, had access to drainage, wastewater, rather than being tossed out windows or into the streets, as in many later civilizations, was guided carefully through underground channels. These drains were lined with bricks and covered with fitted stone slabs. Some were wide enough to crawl through, others were no more than narrow troughs. They ran beneath main streets, connected in networks that required gradients, angles, and careful calculations. No pump, no machinery, only gravity and planning. The people who laid these bricks understood flow. They respected the quiet power of water, not just in the river that sustained them, but in the hidden pipes that kept their cities clean. It is a lesson in foresight, in subtlety. And while we may marvel at the pyramids or the hanging gardens of other ancient lands, the humble drain of Mohenjo-Daro tells us something equally profound, that civility is measured not only in monuments, but in maintenance. In another corner of the city, a craftsman sat by the light of an oil lamp, threading carnelian beads onto a string. These beads, orange-red and glowing faintly in firelight, had been shaped and polished over days. First the stone was sourced, perhaps from the distant mines of Gujarat. Then it was sliced into pieces, drilled with a hand-turned drill using copper and sand, and finally polished to a soft shine using leather and fine dust. The process was quiet, repetitive, meditative, and the end result, a necklace, a bracelet, a handful of trade goods, was not just decoration, it was continuity. It was skill passed down through generations, each artisan learning not just how to make, but how to make well. These beads were traded far and wide. Some have been found in Mesopotamia, thousands of kilometers from where they were made. Others lay buried in Indus graves, still threaded, still whole, untouched by the centuries. In these objects, we see connection, not through empire or conquest, but through beauty, through usefulness, through trust in a shared system of exchange. The Indus people did not hoard art in temples or lock it behind palace doors. Their creations, seals, beads, ceramics, were part of daily life. This integration of function and elegance gives us a glimpse into their worldview. Simplicity was not emptiness, it was intention. As we look deeper, we begin to notice more signs of quiet sophistication. Take the weights, for example. Small stone cubes and cones, precisely shaped, often in binary multiples. These were likely used in trade, perhaps set on small balances to weigh out grain or metal or spices. The smallest weight might represent a single unit, with each larger piece doubling the one before it. This reveals not just a sense of fairness, but of mathematics. Somewhere in the Indus cities, someone understood the logic of 2s and 4s and 8s. Someone recorded these standards and passed them down. And though we do not know their names, we feel their minds in the stones they shaped. As midnight approached, the city fell deeper into silence. Oil lamps flickered and faded. The river flowed in the distance, a constant breath beneath the stars. Somewhere, a child turned in sleep beneath a woven blanket, unaware of the brilliance around her. The wisdom baked into the walls, the order beneath the streets. Her dreams, perhaps, echoed the hum of city life, of footsteps on brick, of water down drains, of quiet mornings and patient hands. And as you lie here now, in your own quiet space, let your thoughts wander there, down those silent streets, past homes of perfect proportion, toward wells that never ran dry. Let the softness of this ancient order wrap around you like a warm cloth. Let the balance, the care, the simplicity lull your senses. For in these forgotten cities, the Indus people built not for power, but for peace, not for spectacle, but for sleep. The early morning mist would sometimes settle over the Indus Valley like a veil, softening the edges of brick buildings and painting the city in muted tones. As the sun climbed slowly over the horizon, its light gradually warmed the reddish clay, revealing the symmetry of rooftops, the order of alleyways, and the quiet elegance of a civilization that did not announce itself with grandeur, but with grace. Within this early light, the streets of Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa would begin to stir, not in haste, but in rhythm. A rhythm guided not by clocks or rulers, but by sun and season, by the needs of the day, and the wisdom of those who came before. Children might begin their chores, fetching water, gathering firewood, or feeding animals in small enclosures beside the home. Their laughter, hushed by morning, might echo faintly down lanes where drains ran beneath their feet, unseen but ever present. These drains, with their methodical construction, are among the civilization's most telling features. Some historians refer to this system as the earliest example of civic engineering. Every major city of the Indus culture featured covered drainage, communal wells, and often public bathing areas, elements that many later civilizations lacked entirely. And these features weren't reserved for elites. Evidence suggests that even modest homes had access to bathing spaces and waste removal systems. This speaks to a society built on shared standards of health and order, not rigid hierarchy. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro is perhaps the most iconic structure from this era. Rectangular in shape and built with fine bricks sealed with bitumen, the bath was set within a courtyard surrounded by small rooms. Wide staircases led down into the pool on either end, and a drain allowed water to flow out in a controlled manner. Though its exact use is debated, many scholars believe it served a ritual function, perhaps related to purification. And yet, it was not a temple, not a place of spectacle or sermon. It was simple, functional, clean, and beautiful in its restraint. This tendency toward balance and clarity can be seen in the artifacts as well. Consider the terracotta figurines, small, hand-shaped, and understated. Some depict animals, others women with elaborate hairstyles or armfuls of bangles. They are not imposing statues or idealized forms, but glimpses of daily life captured in clay. In one, a woman seems to be playing a musical instrument. In another, a child holds a toy cart. These figures do not celebrate gods or kings. They celebrate people, real people. People who lived, worked, rested, and wondered. In the workshops, tools were simple but precise. Stone blades, copper chisels, and weights made of hard chert allowed for consistent production. In bead workshops, tiny drills were crafted to bore through carnelian or agate. This was not mass production in the modern sense, but it was systematic, organized, and it speaks to a knowledge that was shared, not hoarded. There is no evidence of royal insignias or personal emblems on the tools, no name carved in stone to claim invention or glory. What mattered was the process, the outcome, the collective result. Even their script, which remains undeciphered, reflects this enigma. The Indus Valley script appears on seals, small square stone pieces carved with symbols and often accompanied by an animal figure. The symbols are linear and deliberate, repeated across sites over vast distances. Though we cannot yet read their words, their frequency and placement suggest they were not decorative. They were meaningful, practical, perhaps for trade, perhaps for identity, perhaps both. And yet in all this there is a quiet humility. Unlike other ancient civilizations, the Indus Valley left behind no grand declarations, no triumphal inscriptions, no chronicles of conquest. What remains are patterns, bricks, wells, beads, a rhythm of living so deeply ingrained that it speaks across millennia, whispering not of might, but of harmony. As the day continued and the sun rose higher, homes would have grown warm and streets would quiet again. Within shaded courtyards, meals were prepared, flatbreads cooked on hot stones, lentils simmered in clay pots, herbs crushed by hand. Life unfolded slowly, deliberately. There was no rush, only purpose. And now, as you lie still, let that purpose comfort you. Let the calm of a society built on repetition and rhythm soothe your mind. Picture the warmth of sun on ancient stone, the gentle trickle of water through hidden channels, and the soft rustle of palm leaves in a morning breeze. Let it all blend into stillness, into sleep. For the people of the Indus Valley built not only cities, but a world where simplicity was strength, and peace was found in every well-laid brick. By the time afternoon light stretched long shadows across the rooftops of Harappa, the city had settled into its soft midday quiet. The streets, arranged in a meticulous grid of north-south and east-west orientation, lay in muted stillness. This layout, so consistent across Indus settlements, suggests more than just good planning. It suggests an understanding of direction, of celestial order, and of how a city should breathe. There is no evidence of royal decrees mandating this precision, no written law codes preserved in stone. And yet, from Lothal to Kalibangan, from Mohenjo-Daro to Dolavira, the same logic appears again and again. An urban philosophy rooted not in dominance, but in cooperation. Within this orderly framework, the city lived. It did not rise and fall in fanfare. It pulsed gently, like the steady rhythm of breath. The people of the Indus Valley did not leave behind tales of epic battles or palatial grandeur, but they left bricks, baked uniformly, stacked purposefully, and laid with patience. These bricks, standardized in size and proportion, were made from river mud and fired in kilns that dotted the outskirts of town. The choice of materials was practical. The clay, rich and workable, came from the very river that sustained them. Once fired, the bricks were durable, water-resistant, and versatile. Workers likely shaped them by hand using wooden molds, allowing for mass production without machinery. And yet, there was an art to their arrangement. Bonding patterns varied based on structural needs. Some walls required a staggered pattern for strength. Others used vertical layering for thermal control. Builders understood their materials intimately. They knew how to keep heat out during summer and trap warmth in cooler seasons. They didn't write treatises on architecture. They simply built, and what they built endured. Consider also the absence of grand tombs or temples. There are no pyramids, no ziggurats, no monumental statues with arms raised to the sky. Instead, there are homes, workshops, baths, wells, streets. These were not just structures, they were systems, integrated, repetitive, and accessible. In this, the Indus people left behind not a message of power, but of participation. The city was not built for rulers, it was built for living. And within that city, life played out in familiar rhythms. Potters shaped vessels on slow-turning wheels, hands wet with clay, minds focused on the curve of each bowl. The scent of damp earth mixed with wood smoke, drifting through the air. Children, barefoot and curious, may have watched from doorways, their fingers tracing patterns in the dust. In nearby quarters, textile makers twisted cotton fibers into thread. Spindles turned with a hum, and simple looms clacked gently in shaded rooms. The cotton, perhaps one of the first domesticated in the world, grew in fertile fields outside the city. Its fibers were short but usable, and the thread was strong enough to weave into garments suitable for the subtropical climate. Clothing, while not preserved, is believed to have been simple, draped, and likely dyed with natural pigments. In this way, the Indus Valley civilization balanced craft with comfort. A necklace made of glazed faience beads, a finely burnished bowl, a cotton tunic. It was not opulence, but quiet beauty. As afternoon gave way to dusk, the city softened once again. Oil lamps flickered to life, their warm glow reflecting off plastered walls. The flickering light danced over seals pressed into wet clay, rectangular stamps bearing symbols and animals, perhaps used to mark ownership, goods, or even identity. These seals are among the most enigmatic relics of the civilization. Over 4,000 examples have been found, yet none can be read. Their script, composed of brief sequences, no more than 5 symbols, remains undeciphered. Some scholars believe it was a proto-writing system, a shorthand for trade. Others argue it was a full language lost to time. What is clear is their uniformity and care. The symbols are precise. The animals, bulls, elephants, unicorn-like figures, are etched with attention. Each seal fits in the palm, made for use, not display. They hint at a world of agreements, of transactions, of mutual understanding. In this world, value did not lie in conquest, but in clarity, in the slow and steady repetition of fair trade. As stars emerged above, The sounds of the city dimmed to whispers. A bowl scraped empty in a corner, a final jug of water drawn from a well. Somewhere, the faint thrum of a flute echoed down a lane. Life, even as it paused for the night, did not stop. It rested, and in that rest, it prepared to rise again, measured, patient, enduring, just like the bricks beneath it. As the night deepened over the cities of the Indus Valley, darkness brought not fear or chaos, but a gentle quietness. There were no street lamps, no chiming clocks, no urgent horns or glowing screens. Time passed through shadows and starlight, through flickering oil lamps and the slow cooling of clay walls. In the hush, the city did not sleep all at once. Some corners remained active, a craftsman finishing a seal by lamplight, a family tending to a late meal, or a guard seated quietly by a granary entrance, listening to the sounds of the night. These granaries, large, multi-roomed structures with raised floors and air channels, represented more than food storage. They were the city's pulse, holding the lifeblood of its people. Grain, harvested from the fertile floodplains and brought in baskets or bullock carts, was sorted, measured, and stored here for future use. It was likely distributed not as charity, but as part of an organized economic system, possibly tied to labor or trade. What is remarkable is not just the presence of granaries, but their scale and consistency. Built with precision, they stood in alignment with other structures, with walkways, platforms, and even drainage systems surrounding them. Their very existence suggests planning, cooperation, and a shared understanding of responsibility. No single name was carved above the door. No leader's portrait guarded the entrance. It was the community that was preserved within these walls. And that spirit of community echoed throughout every facet of Indus life. Consider the city's water systems again, not just drains and baths, but wells. At regular intervals throughout the cities, circular brick wells descended into the earth. Some served private homes, others were public, accessible from street corners or courtyards. They were engineered with such care that many still exist today, the bricks holding firm through centuries of soil and time. These wells were narrow and deep, built with concentric rings of wedge-shaped bricks to create a cylindrical shaft. At the top, a low parapet wall allowed for drawing water with pots or ropes, and around each well, a subtle wear pattern formed, a record of repeated use, of thousands of hands lifting life upward. Imagine a woman kneeling at the edge of one such well, the early light brushing her shoulders as she lowers a clay pot. She may hum a quiet tune, perhaps one her grandmother once sang. Behind her, a child waits with a second vessel, tapping the ground with bare feet. These are moments not found in textbooks, but they are the heartbeat of the city, the quiet rituals, the simple necessities, the places where time folded into habit and habit into meaning. In workshops nearby, metal workers might begin their tasks, even before sunrise. They did not forge weapons of conquest or chariots of war. Instead, they made tools, chisels, needles, fishhooks, razors. The copper used was sourced from distant lands, perhaps Oman or the Aravalli Hills. It was brought in raw, then smelted and poured into molds or hammered into shape. These tools were often practical, unadorned, but crafted with care. They speak not of extravagance, but of daily life. A chisel used to carve wood for furniture, a razor kept in a clay jar near a home's bathing area, a fishhook that might feed a family. Nearby, a seal carver used a small drill, turned between palms or with a bowstring, to etch designs into steatite. He did not rush. Each line was deliberate, a curve here, a symbol there. The animal, often centered and poised, seemed to leap or crouch or look ahead. No two seals were identical, yet all followed a quiet logic, a balance of form and function, of message and craft. The repetition of this design across the entire civilization suggests shared values, shared symbols, and a wide network of trade or identification. These weren't mass-produced trinkets. They were signatures of a world that valued precision, pattern, and quiet expression. And even further afield, in satellite towns and farming villages, connected by dusty paths or river channels, the same principles echoed. Though smaller, these outposts mirrored the cities. Similar brick styles, similar drain construction, similar tools. This was not an isolated elite building marvels while others watched. This was a shared knowledge, passed hand to hand, home to home. It's easy to forget that history is often built in silence, in steady work, in unnoticed care, in days that pass without event. The Indus Valley civilization teaches us that the grandest achievements are not always the loudest, that cities can rise not through force, but through intention, not through monument, but through maintenance. As the night wore on, a breeze rustled through open courtyards, past low walls, over sleeping dogs and closed doorways. The city exhaled, slowly. The stars moved overhead, unnoticed by those already dreaming. And somewhere, water trickled gently into a basin, echoing softly off stone. It was not a sound meant to impress, but it was a sound meant to last. Morning in the Indus Valley did not arrive with fanfare. There were no bells, no clanging gongs, no loud proclamations echoing across rooftops. Instead, the day began in quiet layers, the soft thud of footsteps on packed earth, the creak of wooden doors being nudged open, the low rustle of baskets being lifted for another day's tasks. The sun rose slowly over the flat plains, casting golden light on brick walls and narrow alleys. Its warmth seeped into the homes, drying the dew from woven mats and warming the stone thresholds where elders might sit, wrapped in shawls, watching the city awaken once more. Inside these homes, life began again with the same quiet rhythm as the day before. The dwellings themselves, modest but purposeful, tell us much about the people who built them. Most houses were 2 stories tall, constructed with uniform baked bricks, and designed around a central courtyard. These courtyards allowed light and air to circulate naturally, keeping the interior cool in the hot season and open to the sky's shifting moods. Rooms lined the courtyard's edge, some used for sleeping, others for cooking, storage, or craft. The upper floor, accessed by simple staircases, provided more private spaces, often used during warmer nights when sleeping under the stars, offered comfort. What's striking is how many of these homes included a bathing area, sometimes with a small drain built directly into the floor. Some even had brick-lined toilets connected to covered drains outside. This wasn't luxury, this was standard. This was the architecture of dignity. In many ways, the Indus cities were designed not for spectacle, but for peace. Streets were straight and wide, especially by ancient standards, and often had raised sidewalks for pedestrians. At intersections, careful planning ensured that water flowed away from homes and public spaces, never pooling where it might invite disease. Even trash disposal had its place. Small pits, often lined or covered, suggest a conscious effort to keep the cities clean and livable. There's a humility in this that is rare in early urban design. No towering temples pierced the skyline. No royal palaces loomed over the people. The cities breathed together, brick by brick, choice by choice. They were places built not to impress, but to endure, and endure they did, for centuries. Through changing rivers, shifting climates, and the gentle march of time, the cities of the Indus remained inhabited and orderly. It was a kind of resilience not forged in battle, but in cooperation. Outside the city walls, farmers rose early too. The fertile floodplains of the Indus and its tributaries made for rich agricultural land, and farming was a cornerstone of life. Using wooden plows and tools made from copper or stone, these farmers tilled wheat, barley, and pulses. Some areas even show evidence of rice cultivation in later periods. Irrigation, while not elaborate, was clearly understood. Canals and ditches guided seasonal waters to crops, and bunds helped contain them. This agriculture was not the product of grand dams or royal decree. It was a collaboration between people and river, between memory and method. Harvests were likely gathered communally, stored in granaries, or bartered for goods from neighboring towns. The exchange was not haphazard. It was systematic. Standardized weights and measures found across the Indus Valley, beautifully carved cubes of chert, and etched ivory scales, suggest a culture that prized fairness. These were not abstract instruments, but tools of trust. A bead trader in Lothal could sell his work in Harappa and expect the same units to apply. A potter in Dolavira might know that the grain she buys was measured just as carefully. Such consistency requires more than tools. It requires a shared understanding, a culture of agreement. And this, perhaps, is the quiet genius of the Indus Valley people. They built a civilization on harmony, not through a single ruler or unifying text, but through repetition, precision, and shared values. In their seals, their bricks, their streets, and their drains, we find echoes of a people who believed in balance. As the sun climbed higher and the morning deepened into day, the city stirred in its gentle way. A young boy chased a goat down an alley. A potter turned his wheel beside a shaded wall. Somewhere, the thud of a mortar matched the rhythm of footsteps passing by. There were no trumpets, no carved declarations, no statues watching from on high. But in that rhythm, in that repetition, there was something sacred. A way of life built not on dominance, but on detail. Not on hierarchy, but on habit. Not on glory, but on grace. As afternoon descended once more upon the great cities of the Indus Valley, time seemed to move slower, as if the sun itself were pausing to admire what had been built below. The heat mellowed, shadows stretched across flat rooftops, and the streets gradually emptied of foot traffic. People retreated indoors or to the shade of narrow alleyways. It was a time for stillness, for meals shared in courtyards, for soft conversation and cool water poured from clay jars. Even in their silence, these cities remained alive, not bustling with noise or spectacle, but humming with the quiet rhythms of life well-designed. One could walk from the edge of a city like Mohenjo-Daro all the way to its center without encountering chaos or congestion. The straight streets, methodically intersected by narrower lanes, reflected a kind of logic rarely seen in early civilizations. And along these streets, the same patterns repeated. Homes with internal courtyards, private wells, modest workshops, and bathing spaces connected to drainage systems that ran beneath the surface. The consistency of these urban features suggests not only careful design, but deep cultural agreement. No king's edict was found proclaiming order, no singular vision carved into stone. Instead, the evidence speaks of consensus, of a people who shared not only a landscape, but a mindset. And that mindset extended beyond architecture. In the quiet artifacts of the Indus Valley, small terracotta figurines, carved shell ornaments, bone tools, and the ever-present seals, we glimpse a civilization comfortable in its identity. These items were not made for foreign rulers or elite ceremonies. They were for use, for ritual, for beauty, and for belonging. Some seals show processions of animals. Others show seated figures, possibly deities or revered ancestors. But none seek grandeur, none boast of empire. Even the so-called priest-king statue, found with a calm expression and a patterned robe, is only a few inches tall, modest in form, yet precise in craftsmanship, a symbol not of domination, but of grace. Outside the cities, traders loaded goods onto bullock carts. Paths stretched westward toward what is now Iran, and eastward toward the Ganges Plain. To the south, Lothal connected the Indus world to the Arabian Sea, with a dockyard and warehouse that once held bundles of cotton, beads, and grains. Trade was not merely survival, it was extension. It was communication through things. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, shells from the Makran coast. All these found their way into the hands of Indus artisans, who transformed them into tools, jewelry, and expressions of shared life. And yet, for all its reach, the civilization left no monuments of ego. No towering ziggurats, no blood-soaked chronicles, no sculpted battles. Its greatest legacy is perhaps its quietude, its refusal to shout. As twilight approached, families gathered on rooftops to catch the last of the day's breeze. They ate simply, perhaps wheat cakes, lentils, fruits harvested from nearby groves. Oil lamps were lit one by one, casting soft pools of light against sun-baked walls. In some homes, a potter placed newly shaped vessels beside the hearth to dry overnight. In others, an elder traced symbols into the dust, telling stories that were never written down but always remembered. And above them, the stars returned, watching as they had for centuries, over cities that did not seek to conquer, but to endure. The Indus script, still undeciphered, may one day reveal more. It might speak of laws, of poetry, of prayer, or it may simply say what the cities themselves already whisper, that order, cleanliness, and community are not born from command, but from care. That cities can be grand not because they reach upward, but because they last. Sometime around 1900 BCE, the cities began to change. Rivers shifted, trade routes evolved, climate patterns altered. Slowly, people moved away. The cities emptied not in violence, but in migration. There are no signs of invasion, no burnt layers, just an exhale. a gradual return of silence. And yet, in their fading, these cities left behind a blueprint, not of power, but of peace. The bricks remain, the wells remain, the drains, the waits, the streets, the courtyards, they remain. And in them, a message endures, that civilization does not always need to roar. Sometimes, it can simply whisper and be remembered, long after voices fade. That brings us to the end of the previous story. Before we begin our next journey, if you've enjoyed this quiet moment together, I'd be truly grateful if you could give the video a like and consider subscribing. Your small gesture helps keep these stories flowing. Now, let's continue with our next tale in the Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we gently drift into the fading light of another ancient world, the quiet decline of the Minoans. It begins not with thunder, but with silence. The Minoans, who once painted their palaces with the colors of the sea, who carved bulls into stone and danced in open courtyards, did not leave behind grand farewell speeches or tales of final battles. Their decline was not shouted across the hills of Crete. It was whispered, faded, slipped into stillness like a tide retreating from the shore. The island of Crete, in the middle of the sparkling Aegean, had once been the beating heart of a civilization that knew how to build with elegance and live with rhythm. Long before Athens rose to power, before Sparta flexed its might, the Minoans built palaces, not for war, but for ritual, trade, and daily life. Their most famous palace at Knossos was not a fortress. It had no defensive walls. Instead, it sprawled across the landscape like a puzzle of light and shadow, full of airy rooms, colorful frescoes, and staircases that seemed to lead not just between floors, but between worlds. By the middle of the second millennium BCE, around 1600 BCE, Minoan society had matured into something serene and structured. The sea brought ships filled with copper, tin, spices, and stories. Minoan scribes recorded goods in Linear A script still undeciphered. Potters spun vases with spirals that echoed ocean waves. Women in flounced skirts and open bodices officiated at ceremonies beneath blooming lilies. Everything seemed balanced. The cities hummed with life, yet never with violence. There were no towering statues of kings, no victory inscriptions carved in stone. Instead, we find images of dolphins swimming on palace walls, of people gathering saffron, of youths leaping over bulls in games that may have blended danger with devotion. But like all things shaped by time, something shifted, slowly. The frescoes began to peel. The storerooms, once brimming with oil and wine, emptied. Roofs collapsed, not in battle but in neglect. By the time later civilizations looked back, they saw only ruins. Yet what happened? What took this peaceful and graceful society and led it into decline? The answers do not come easily. They are not found in a single dramatic moment. Instead, we must wander quietly through the layers of earth, through the patterns in pottery shards, through the whispers of ash and tremors. And perhaps we begin with the land itself. Crete sits not just upon the sea, but upon the restless edge of tectonic plates. Earthquakes were not strangers. The ground had always trembled now and then, shaking the pillars and walls, reminding those above that nothing built is ever fully permanent. Around 1700 BCE, a great earthquake destroyed the original palace at Knossos and other centers, but the Minoans rebuilt, stronger, more elaborate. Their response was not fear but renewal. Yet, just over a century later, a much greater force stirred, not on Crete, but to the north, on the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini. There, around 1600 to 1500 BCE, a massive volcanic eruption shattered the island in a fury of ash, gas, and molten stone. The eruption sent a cloud so high it reached the stratosphere. The noise would have echoed across seas, but the silence that followed was more devastating. Ash may have blanketed parts of Crete. Tsunamis may have swept the coastlines. The Minoans, so tied to the sea, may have lost not just boats and ports, but confidence. The very waters that had nourished them turned suddenly hostile. Still, decline does not always follow disaster. The eruption alone did not destroy the Minoans. Their palaces remained. Trade routes were disrupted, but not severed. People continued to live, to harvest, to worship. Yet something subtle had shifted. And so we begin this quiet journey into the twilight of Minoan civilization, not through conquest or collapse, but through gentle erosion. through the loss of confidence. The unraveling of connections, the way a vibrant culture, full of light and motion, began to slow and fade, and fall quiet beneath layers of earth and time. In the years following the great eruption of Thera, life on Crete did not immediately stop. Farmers still tended to barley fields, potters still turned their wheels, merchants still loaded goods into woven baskets, preparing them for voyages across the blue Aegean. The sun still rose over the whitewashed walls of Knossos. But beneath this surface continuity, subtle changes began to stir, quiet shifts in rhythm that, over time, would reshape the entire society. The palaces, once vibrant centers of culture and commerce, began to change their function. Some parts were rebuilt, others left in partial ruin. Storage rooms that had once overflowed with grain and oil began to show signs of neglect. Clay tablets record fewer goods, fewer transactions. The scribes, whose hands had once moved swiftly over wet clay, began to slow. The language they used, linear A, remained undeciphered, locked behind time, but even in its symbols we see a narrowing of scope. The once complex networks of trade that had tied Crete to Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia began to fray. Ships that once brought luxury goods now came less often. Foreign pottery, once abundant, became rare. It wasn't an invasion, it was something gentler, a drifting away, a gradual dimming of connections. Within the walls of Knossos, life likely continued for some time, in a muted form. But the frescoes faded. The bull-leaping courts fell into disuse. Fewer artisans were needed, less dye was prepared for textiles. The economy, once so deeply intertwined with the rhythms of the sea, turned inward. The people adapted. Some moved to smaller settlements, away from the palatial centers. They built simpler homes, closer to the earth. The countryside of Crete, still fertile, offered refuge. Vineyards and olive groves continued to flourish. But the unity that had once defined Minoan culture, the shared symbols, the shared architecture, the shared rhythms, began to dissolve. And then, from across the water, new ships appeared, not bearing trade, but presence. Not Minoan, but Mycenaean. These people, from the Greek mainland, brought a different tone, one shaped more by fortresses than by frescoes. The Mycenaeans were not unknown to the Minoans. For generations they had traded. But now, in the wake of Crete's vulnerability, their influence grew bolder. Around 1450 BCE, many of the palatial centers across Crete were suddenly destroyed. Fire left black marks on walls, once painted with dolphins and lilies. Storehouses were abandoned mid-use. Tools were left where they fell. In this sudden moment, still debated by scholars, the peaceful Minoan way of life met a rupture. Some believe the Mycenaeans invaded. Others suggest internal unrest, perhaps magnified by earlier natural disasters. But whatever the cause, the effect was clear. The old Minoan order had ended. And yet, even in this ending, the Minoans did not vanish. At Knossos, the palace was rebuilt again, this time under Mycenaean control. But the style changed. Linear, the script of the Mycenaeans, replaced the older linear A. The new rulers took over the bureaucratic systems, the storerooms, and the temples. But the soul of the civilization, the quiet elegance of Minoan life, slowly slipped away. Even so, the old rituals did not disappear overnight. Echoes of Minoan religion, of the sacred caves and mountaintop shrines, lingered. Pottery still bore swirling sea motifs, even as forms stiffened. The goddess figurines, once so central, were buried carefully, as if laid to rest rather than discarded. There was no final curtain, no single act of destruction. Instead, the Minoans faded like mist in morning light, still present in outline, but no longer fully seen. The silence was not immediate. It deepened slowly, like the quiet that follows a storm. The people who remained carried fragments of a once thriving culture. They remembered the songs, the dances, the rituals. But with each passing generation, fewer voices sang them. And so, as you lay still, listening in the quiet, imagine those last twilight years of Minoan Crete, a land where bulls once danced with youth, where color bloomed on every wall, where the sea brought news from far-off lands, and where, in the end, the greatest beauty lay not in how they rose, but in how they receded, gracefully, gently, like the tide returning to the open sea. As the Mycenaean presence on Crete became more pronounced, the once distinct identity of Minoan society began to blur. The island, so long governed by its own quiet rhythms and rituals, found itself slowly reshaped. Not by war, not by mandates, but by the slow infiltration of new customs, new language, and new priorities. The palaces, once expansive hubs of communal life and ceremony, began to serve different masters. Knossos, now the administrative heart under Mycenaean control, became more focused on accounting, inventory, and control. The once fluid and artistic linear A script gave way to linear B, a sharper, more utilitarian script used to track commodities like oil, wine, grain, and livestock. Where Minoan scribes may have once marked shipments bound for friendly shores, now they recorded tributes and taxes. The walls that once bore images of leaping dolphins and open ceremonies were repainted, covered, or simply left to fade. The new leaders preserved the architecture, but not always the atmosphere. The open courtyards became less communal, the sanctuaries less active. One can almost imagine a former Minoan priestess walking past the familiar columns of Knossos, noticing subtle differences, the absence of incense, the changed order of offerings, the different accent of the voices that now echoed through the halls. It wasn't just the palaces that changed. In the countryside, daily life adjusted. Smaller settlements became more self-reliant. The centralization that had once defined Minoan governance began to dissipate. People still baked bread, tended vineyards, and shaped pottery, but fewer hands touched each object. The once busy workshops of the palace grounds fell quiet, replaced by more modest efforts in the hills and valleys. Meanwhile, religious practice evolved. The Minoans had long embraced a form of spirituality deeply tied to the natural world. Caves, mountain peaks, and groves were sacred. Offerings of food, figurines, and carved stone tokens were placed not to please distant gods of war, but to honor the earth and sky, the cycle of seasons, and perhaps the mysterious feminine force often depicted in statues with raised arms and flowing skirts. But under Mycenaean influence, religion began to shift toward hierarchy. Larger temples replaced open-air altars. Priests may have become intermediaries rather than participants in communal rites. The gods acquired names, perhaps borrowed from the mainland pantheon. Sacrifices became more formal. The spiritual looseness of the Minoans was slowly replaced by something more rigid. And yet, the island did not erupt in rebellion. The people adapted. Generations passed. Children born under the new regime learned to read linear B, not A. They grew up hearing stories of Mycenaean heroes instead of Minoan myths. They did not forget the past. They simply stopped returning to it. Time, after all, is the gentlest eraser. Archaeologists, centuries later, would sift through the ruins and find signs of this quiet transformation. A Minoan-style cup buried beneath a Mycenaean-style hearth, or a broken fresco depicting a Minoan dance with new figures added in a stiffer posture. The two cultures mingled, not in harmony, but in overlapping layers, like watercolor strokes that never fully dry. Even trade patterns changed. The once seaborne Minoans, masters of ship and sail, saw their maritime dominance fade. The Mycenaeans preferred overland routes when possible. And while they did continue sea trade, it was not with the same grace or volume. Crete, once a vibrant hub, now became more peripheral. The harbors remained, but the ships grew fewer. Foreign pottery found in Cretan ruins after 1400 BCE is scarcer and often imported through Mycenaean intermediaries. Crete no longer led the dance, it followed. Still, there is no clear line where the Minoan world ends and the Mycenaean one begins. The transition was uneven, slow, and deeply human. There were likely villages that retained Minoan traditions well into the 13th century BCE. In remote valleys and coastal hamlets, songs were still sung in the old tongue, meals were prepared with the same herbs and spices, and prayers were whispered into the same sacred groves. But the world had shifted. The great age of Minoan palaces and pageantry had receded. What remained was quieter, simpler, and slowly dissolving into the folds of history. And as we drift deeper into this ancient past, we remember that decline is not always destruction. Sometimes, it is simply forgetting. A culture can fade not because it was conquered, but because it was absorbed, outgrown, or gently left behind. As the decades passed, the lines that had once clearly defined Minoan identity continued to blur, replaced not with immediate silence, but with a quieter rhythm of survival. By the late 14th century BCE, what remained of Minoan culture existed more in gestures than in grandeur. In the small farming communities scattered across Crete's hills and plains, daily life was less ceremonial, more practical. Families passed down farming techniques perfected generations earlier. Methods of terracing land to prevent erosion, storing water in clay cisterns, and cultivating olives, barley, and grapes with patient precision. These were not grand innovations, but rather ancient practices carried forward by quiet hands. The once complex palatial economic system had given way to a simpler, more localized economy, less reliant on distant trade, more focused on immediate needs. Even the architecture began to change. The tall, multi-storied palaces of Knossos and Phaistos, with their labyrinthine halls and light wells, were no longer replicated. In their place, homes became modest, low, single-storied dwellings of mud brick and stone, their walls whitewashed but unadorned. They were functional, easy to rebuild, and spoke not of ambition, but of endurance. These homes did not seek to impress, they simply sheltered. And within them, people still gathered at hearths, still cooked meals with lentils and onions, still baked bread on clay slabs. The rituals of everyday life, stripped of grandeur, remained deeply human. It is possible that in the evenings, when work was done and the air cooled, someone would still sing an old song. Perhaps the tune had been passed down from a time when frescoes danced on palace walls, when music and movement marked the seasons. But now the voice was quieter, the audience smaller. The meaning of the words may have changed, or been forgotten entirely. On the spiritual front, while the old gods and goddesses were no longer enshrined in vast temple complexes, many sacred practices persisted in altered forms. Shrines remained in caves, on mountain peaks, and beneath ancient trees. Offerings became simpler: a few grains of barley, a smooth stone, a cup of water left beside a spring. The Minoans had never worshipped in grand crowds. Their spirituality had always been intimate, tied to nature and space, and that quiet reverence now fit the times more than ever. It was not resistance, it was continuity in soft form. Meanwhile, the political landscape across the Aegean was growing increasingly tense. On the mainland, the Mycenaeans were reaching their zenith. Palatial centers like Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns bustled with activity, with fortified walls rising and warrior elites asserting their power. Their scribes wrote on clay tablets with methodical precision. They recorded not just goods and labor, but also references to war and preparation, indications of an age growing more anxious, more militarized. Crete, though under Mycenaean control, did not mirror this energy. Its lands did not bristle with new fortresses. Its people did not march in legions. The Cretans, shaped by centuries of trade and art, of open courtyards and maritime ease, did not transform overnight into Mycenaean warriors. The culture absorbed what it could but remained distinct in temperament. Archaeological layers show a curious blend of styles: a Mycenaean-style crater decorated in a Minoan motif, or a burial that combines both Minoan rituals and Mycenaean grave goods. It was not a clean break. It was a slow, uneven overlay. And as the 13th century BCE approached, trouble stirred further afield. Across the eastern Mediterranean, cities fell to mysterious forces: sea peoples, earthquakes, internal collapse. Hatti, Ugarit, and even mighty Mycenae would all feel the tremors of a broader Bronze Age unraveling. Trade routes were disrupted. Writing systems vanished. Urban centers were abandoned. But Crete had already withdrawn from the stage. It had already downsized, slowed, simplified. And so, while it was affected, it was not destroyed. Its quiet may have helped it endure. This withdrawal, this fading, did not feel like defeat. It felt like retreat into the ordinary, into a life closer to the soil and Skanth. The Minoans did not go out with a final battle. They simply stopped being noticed. They stopped leading the fleets. They stopped painting the walls. But their hands kept working, their feet kept walking worn paths, and their language, though never fully deciphered, likely echoed in valleys long after the last Linear A tablet was written. In this way, Crete became less a beacon and more a whisper. And it is that whisper we strain to hear today, not through kings or wars or monuments, but through pottery shards, faint frescoes, and silent ruins warmed by the same sun they once knew. By the turn of the 13th century BCE, the fading light of Minoan civilization had settled into something steady but subdued. The great palatial complexes, once the hubs of religious, administrative, and artistic life, had either fallen into disuse or been repurposed for more utilitarian needs. Some rooms that once housed sacred ceremonies or delicate frescoes now served as storerooms, their decorative walls crumbling under the weight of forgotten cargo. Others remained empty, dust swirling softly across mosaic floors, as if echoing the absence of the many feet that once passed through. There were no sudden catastrophes in this phase, no dramatic flames to erase the past. It was the erosion of time and purpose, a quiet transition from the ornate to the ordinary. And yet, even in this decline, traces of continuity lingered, faint yet unmistakable. Across the island, artisans still shaped clay, though the motifs were simpler. No longer were octopuses and lilies carefully painted across amphorae. Now the designs leaned toward more geometric patterns, reflecting a shift in taste or perhaps an audience. Metal workers, once responsible for ceremonial blades and decorative pins, now focused on tools and more practical implements. The richness of the craft remained, but the context had changed. These were no longer items meant to adorn elites at palace banquets. They were instruments for tilling, storing, and enduring. In towns and villages, daily life likely unfolded with the same steady rhythm that had persisted for centuries. Women still spun flax into thread, using weighted spindles, and wove it into linen. Farmers still pressed olives for oil, stored grain in pithoi, and herded goats through stone terraces shaped generations earlier. Children learned the stories of their ancestors, though perhaps with less reverence, or without the formal rituals that once accompanied the oral traditions. Memory, like architecture, was becoming simpler, more domestic. The old myths may have survived in fragmented form, retold at firesides, adapted to changing tongues. Perhaps the tale of the labyrinth lived on, no longer tied to Minos or Daedalus, but now as a cautionary tale about pride or fate. Or maybe by this time, the very word Minoan no longer meant anything to those who lived in its shadow. They didn't see themselves as the last of a fading culture. They were just people, living, working, and adapting. And while they may not have understood their place in a longer historical arc, they understood the sea, the land, the seasons. That was enough. Meanwhile, the broader Mediterranean world was beginning to fray. The great powers that had defined the late Bronze Age were now vulnerable. Hatti had grown brittle under the weight of court intrigue and external threats. Egypt faced repeated incursions from mysterious sea peoples. The Mycenaean world, which had spread its influence across the Aegean with vigor, was beginning to show cracks in its fortified walls. Linear B tablets from the mainland speak of anxiety, of rationing, of missing shipments, of mobilization. Trade slowed. Communication between kingdoms became uncertain. Into this fragile environment, Crete offered no resistance, nor did it play a leading role. The island remained peripheral, untroubled, perhaps forgotten. That isolation, once a limitation, now provided a strange kind of shelter. When collapse came for the mainland, Crete had already lowered its flame. There were still signs of contact, of course. Pottery from the Greek mainland continued to arrive, albeit in smaller quantities. A few imported items suggest that elite exchange still existed, at least in name. But these were the ripples of habit, not the tides of influence. The Minoan legacy was now sediment, gently settling at the bottom of the Aegean world. Still, even as central authority disintegrated, there were pockets where old customs persisted. Cretan religion, always more about continuity than conquest, found ways to adapt. The figurines of the snake goddess, once a hallmark of Minoan artistry and belief, gave way to simpler clay offerings. The elaborate peak sanctuaries of old may have fallen out of use, but humble altars remained, tucked into valleys and caves. The need to connect with something beyond, the earth, the cycles, did not fade. It merely found quieter, less conspicuous forms. The people of Crete survived because they knew how to adapt without noise. They had no grand armies, no fortresses to defend, and perhaps no delusions of empire. Their strength was in their rhythm. It was in how they moved with the land, rather than against it. As kingdoms fell elsewhere, the people of Crete kept farming, kept weaving, kept praying to a sky that neither rose nor set any faster than before. This was not the end of a civilization, it was its transformation into something smaller, humbler, but still human. And in that quiet continuity, in that refusal to vanish completely, the Minoans achieved something few ancient powers did. They faded gently, with grace, and that grace lingered in the silence they left behind. As the centuries edged onward, the traces of Minoan civilization began to sink deeper into the earth and memory. Villages that had once thrived under the shade of great palatial centers became quieter, more isolated, their stories growing fainter with each passing generation. The once bustling harbors along the northern coast of Crete, which had for centuries served as gateways to Egypt, the Levant, and the Greek mainland, now hosted smaller boats and simpler goods. The ships that departed no longer carried luxury items or elaborate tribute. They carried sacks of grain, bundles of wool, and clay jars of oil. The island had shifted from being a cultural innovator to a humble participant in a shrinking economic world. And still, the people endured. In many ways, they adapted not by resisting change, but by flowing around it. They made do with what was available, repurposing older buildings and tools, using the bones of their ancestors' grandeur to build the framework of modest survival. Fallen stones from abandoned temples were gathered and reused in boundary walls and house foundations. Frescoes, once admired for their beauty, were now crumbling behind shelves or covered with soot from family hearths. In time, the memories of what those frescoes meant would fade, leaving only shapes and colors without names. A child growing up in such a village may have passed those images daily without knowing they were once sacred. Language, too, was changing. The once mysterious script of linear A had already begun to disappear, and with it, the ability to read records left behind by previous generations. In its place, linear B, used by the Mycenaeans, took hold in certain administrative centers, but only briefly. It would not last long enough to root itself deeply in Crete. And so, like voices carried on the wind, much of the Minoan written world vanished. The island that had once been among the earliest to write would, for centuries to come, become silent again. Oral traditions took its place. Stories were no longer etched in clay, but spoken in twilight, passed from grandmother to child, changing ever so slightly with each telling. Those stories likely blended myth and memory, tales of bull kings, sun-painted palaces, and women who danced with serpents in their hands. Whether those listening understood they were hearing history or fantasy, no one could say. Perhaps it didn't matter. Meanwhile, across the broader region, the storm of the late Bronze Age collapse intensified. On the mainland, the Mycenaean centers were sacked, their administrative networks shattered. The Hittite Empire dissolved. Trade connections, once linking Anatolia to Cyprus to Crete and beyond, fractured like broken pottery. A kind of darkness settled across the eastern Mediterranean, not one of total extinction, but one of fragmentation. Cities still stood, people still lived, but the great orchestration of interconnected kingdoms had come undone. In that silence, Crete endured not through force or fortune, but through quiet persistence. Its communities were small enough to adapt quickly, simple enough to survive without external support, resilient enough to weather the collapse of empires because they no longer depended on them. And while the rest of the region struggled to rebuild, the people of Crete continued their humble routines, tending to terraced vineyards, gathering herbs in the hills, watching the clouds roll over olive groves, just as their ancestors had done. Archaeological remains from this period show fewer luxuries, but more stability than in neighboring regions. The material culture became plainer, less decorative, more durable. Homes were built with functionality in mind. Tools were sharpened for use, not display. Burials were modest, with few grave goods, suggesting that wealth, status, and spectacle had lost their former significance. What mattered now was continuity, not display. The gods, too, had changed. The great goddesses of fertility and renewal were still worshipped in some form, but their depictions were less elaborate. The clay figurines that once stood with uplifted arms and intricately carved robes now appeared as small, featureless tokens, perhaps not less holy, but more personal, more accessible. Religious practice, once tied to central shrines and palatial rituals, had turned inward. Caves, springs, and mountaintops became the new temples, places where individuals or small groups might leave a simple offering or a whispered prayer. And still, the island breathed. The rhythms of wind and tide, of harvest and hearth, remained unchanged. There were no triumphs to record, no kings to crown, no wars to win. But there was survival, quiet and unremarkable, yet profoundly enduring. The Minoans, or what was left of them, had done something rare. They had stepped out of history's spotlight and found peace in the shadows, not because they chose to be forgotten, but because they knew how to live when no one was watching. The landscape of Crete in the post-palatial era had shifted in subtle yet undeniable ways. The once carefully terraced hillsides, built to maximize agriculture for a thriving palace economy, now bore the marks of smaller, more personal farming. Families cultivated just enough grain and olives to support themselves and their neighbors, rather than to feed a royal elite or support an export network. The great storage jars, pithoi, were still used, but not in the grand magazine rooms of Knossos or Malea. Instead, they were nestled into corners of simple stone homes, filled with provisions for a single season rather than a surplus meant to impress. The population of the island likely dwindled, not due to calamity, but from the slow, natural decline that follows the collapse of central organization. Without the draw of palatial employment or the need for vast labor networks, many people migrated from the larger centers to more isolated inland villages. These new settlements were tucked into valleys and hilltops, chosen more for defensibility and water access than for trade routes or ceremonial significance. The architecture changed accordingly. Gone were the spacious, multi-storied buildings with their graceful columns and airy courtyards. In their place stood squat, functional homes, thick-walled against the elements, built with stone and timber, roofed with thatch or clay. These homes were not meant to awe visitors, but to shelter families. Inside rooms served multiple purposes: a single hearth for cooking, warmth and gathering, a sleeping area shared by all, a space to grind grain, weave cloth, and tell stories by lamplight. The rhythm of daily life was simple, yet unbroken. Mornings may have begun with the sound of handmills turning barley into coarse flour, followed by the lighting of small fires for flatbread and boiled lentils. Afternoons were spent tending animals, mending fences, and watching the younger children chase goats or roll clay into shapes. In the evenings, the wind through the olive trees and the scent of dried herbs hanging from wooden beams marked the slow passage of time. Though the grand days of Crete's influence had passed, these moments, quiet and domestic, were filled with a different kind of strength. The economy no longer rested on trade with distant lands, but on local resilience. Shepherds led flocks to graze along familiar paths. Fishermen set out in modest boats, bringing back enough to feed their kin. Women worked spindle and loom, dyeing wool and natural pigments to create fabrics that were warm, practical, and sometimes still beautiful. In the absence of kings and scribes, the village elders likely held sway. Their authority stemmed not from inherited titles, but from experience and memory. They remembered the old roads, the hidden springs, the myths that explained the stars. They preserved the customs of planting and harvesting, the taboos of certain days, the songs sung during long winter nights. What had once been written on clay tablets was now remembered through repetition, fragile, yes, but living. The arts, though diminished in grandeur, had not vanished. Potters continued to shape vessels by hand, adapting old techniques into simpler forms. Patterns became more abstract, and designs were carved rather than painted. Music might have survived in the plucking of stringed instruments or the beat of a hand drum during communal gatherings. Dance, too, persisted, not in palatial festivals, but in weddings, seasonal rites, and moments of shared joy. And while the island was no longer a nexus of power, it still held meaning. Travelers from the mainland, if they arrived at all, might have found Crete unchanged in some essential ways. The blue sky stretched just as wide, the sea lapped against the shore with the same lullaby rhythm. The people spoke a tongue that bore echoes of the old Minoan language, now mixed with mainland dialects. They lived with the past, not to preserve it, but because it had quietly become part of them. No one called themselves Minoan anymore. That name, if it had ever been known to the people themselves, was gone. What remained was simply home. The island endured as a place of continuity, where change came slowly, softly, and without fanfare. There were no great monuments built during this time, no new palaces rose. But perhaps that was not a loss. Perhaps the true legacy of the Minoans was not in their frescoes or thrones, but in their ability to live through endings without losing themselves. And in the hush of those forgotten centuries, Crete breathed on, its people tending the earth, lighting their hearths, and watching the stars just as their ancestors had done, when the world still listened to their song. As time drifted forward, the island of Crete entered a phase that archaeologists sometimes struggle to define, not because it lacked events, but because its history was whispered rather than declared. This was a time without kings, without formal archives, without monuments inscribed in stone. Yet, this period was not empty. It was filled with quiet living, with the enduring habits of a people who no longer sought to impress the world, but simply to persist. The traces of their lives are scattered across the landscape in humble places. A cluster of homes on a wind-blown ridge, a kiln nestled beside a dry riverbed, shards of pottery buried beneath layers of ash and earth. From these fragments we catch glimpses, not of conquests or gold, but of meals cooked, of children raised, of people who found meaning in routine. In this era, Crete was no longer the heart of a trade empire. The grand ships that once sailed between Egypt and Cyprus, laden with tin, textiles, and perfumes, had largely ceased their journeys. International commerce collapsed in much of the eastern Mediterranean, but the sea remained. Fishermen still ventured out each morning, casting their nets into waters that had not changed. The islanders became more self-sufficient. Small inland fields yielded barley and lentils. Olive groves continued to produce oil, though fewer amphorae were needed to store it. Grapes were still harvested and crushed by bare feet in shallow pits, and the wine they made flowed at weddings and feasts, warming the hearts of people who no longer celebrated with royalty, but with one another. The collapse of palatial centers also meant the decline of centralized religion. The great cults once associated with palace complexes faded or transformed. The snake goddess no longer stood in marble chambers. Her memory, if she lived on at all, might have been echoed in whispered blessings or household charms. Rural sanctuaries, often located near caves or hilltops, became the new spiritual centers. There, families left simple offerings, a clay figure, a handful of grain, a splash of wine poured into the soil. These gestures were not meant for grandeur. They were intimate acts, offered in silence. The rhythms of nature became even more central to spiritual life. The changing of seasons, the phases of the moon, the cycles of planting and harvest, these were now the calendar of the sacred. Without written records to mark festivals, people relied on memory and sky. A certain bird's song might signal the time for sowing, the first frost, the end of the growing year. It was a spirituality of observation, not doctrine, one that responded to the world as it was, rather than trying to shape it. In their isolation, the islanders became more attuned to their land. Paths were cut not by architects, but by footsteps worn over time. Villages followed the contours of hills, adapting to the slope rather than leveling it. Stone walls meandered like the roots of olive trees, enclosing small herds or marking property in places where maps did not exist. Family knowledge passed through generations in gestures and tasks rather than in books. How to plant onions by the moonlight, how to find the spring that never dried, how to treat a fever with bitter herbs boiled slowly, strained through cloth. These were not written in linear A or carved into stelae, but lived and repeated day by day until they became indistinguishable from instinct. The people of Crete still traveled, though their journeys were shorter. A day's walk to visit kin in another valley, a morning spent at a village market exchanging eggs for cloth or oil for honey. Along the way, they might pause beneath a tamarisk tree or stop at a shrine, fingers brushing stone worn smooth by others who had prayed before. They might sing to themselves, or listen for the call of a shepherd in the distance, or the clinking of goat bells echoing through olive groves. The pace of life was gentle, unhurried, unrecorded. Yet, even in this simplicity, there was resilience. Droughts came, storms battered the coasts, illness swept through villages, and still the people endured. They had become quiet masters of survival, not through conquest or glory, but through humility, community, and patience. Their legacy, in many ways, is not found in what they built, but in what they preserved. The thread of human continuity that connects one life to another, one season to the next, without fanfare. The grandeur of Knossos had faded, its frescoes chipped and its halls emptied. But a grandmother still sat by the hearth, teaching a child to knead dough, a father still carved wood by lamplight, shaping handles for tools his own father had taught him to make. In these moments, history did not disappear. It simply grew quieter. As generations passed, the memory of the great Minoan palaces became distant, then faded almost entirely from daily life. There were no monuments raised in their honor, no written epics to tell their tales. The ruins remained, crumbling walls overtaken by earth and time, silent staircases leading nowhere, fragments of painted plaster buried beneath dust. But those who walked past them rarely paused. For the people of post-palatial Crete, these remnants were not symbols of a lost golden age, but simply part of the landscape, shapes half claimed by olive trees, stones worn smooth by wind, and goats' hooves. It's likely that few villagers remembered the names of kings or the meaning of ancient rituals. They may have heard stories from grandparents about days when ships brought wealth and color to the harbors, when dancers performed in the courtyards of Knossos, when sacred bulls were honored in shadowed chambers. But these tales were fragments, half true, softened by time, retold by firelight in homes far humbler than the palaces of old. The world had changed. The center no longer held. And yet the island endured, as did its people. While historians often speak of collapse, what occurred on Crete was more a transformation, a slow, steady shifting from complexity to simplicity. This was not the fall of a people, but the quiet reweaving of life into smaller, tighter threads. Without a ruling elite to enforce taxes or command tribute, wealth was no longer hoarded but shared in modest ways. A good olive harvest might mean oil for the whole village. A skilled weaver's cloth might become a wedding gift, its pattern simple but meaningful. Goods moved not on vast trade ships, but by hand and donkey between nearby communities, each offering what it had and taking what it needed. Even language shifted. The scripts once used to record inventories and temple offerings, Linear A and later Linear B, disappeared. Without scribes, knowledge became oral once more. Songs held the stories, riddles taught values. The patterns of stars guided time, just as they had before the first palace stone was ever laid. Children learned not from formal schools, but from watching, listening, doing. A boy would follow his mother to the fields and see how she read the soil. A girl would help her uncle patch a roof, learning how to find the right stone for balance and warmth. This was education of the hands and the heart, not of scrolls or styluses. And though these skills were never written down, they endured for centuries. Spiritual life, too, became more private and local. There were no longer priesthoods with official duties, no state-sponsored rituals to the gods. Instead, faith settled into the rhythms of the home and the seasons. A family might leave a few grapes beneath an old tree as thanks for a harvest. A traveler might place a stone at a crossroads cairn, whispering a quiet hope for safe passage. Births, deaths, unions, each was marked with gestures older than memory, drawn from a well of tradition deeper than any one era. It is likely that people still felt awe at the natural world. The sun rising red over the Aegean, the first thunderstorm of spring, the sudden bloom of wildflowers after rain. These moments required no temples to feel holy. The divine had moved into the ordinary. It flickered in hearth flames, in the cry of an owl, in the hush that followed snowfall in the hills. Despite the simplicity of their lives, these post-palatial communities were not primitive. Their homes were sturdy, their tools efficient, their relationships layered with respect and responsibility. Elders were valued not for titles, but for their memory, keepers of old places, old agreements, old ways. When decisions needed to be made, they were made around fires or under trees, with voices raised not in debate, but in slow, careful discussion. There was no throne, but there was wisdom. There was no palace, but there was belonging. From a historian's perspective, this might seem like a decline. From within, though, it may have felt like stability. After all, what is civilization if not the capacity to endure? The Minoans had once dazzled the ancient world with their artistry, their ships, their palaces painted in red and gold. But perhaps their truest legacy lay not in what they built, but in how their descendants lived after the music faded, quietly, patiently, in rhythm with the land and with one another. In the final phases of Minoan history, Even the name Minoan had likely lost its meaning to those still walking the sun-warmed hills of Crete. The people no longer identified themselves by dynasties or ancient palaces, but simply as villagers, shepherds, potters, fishermen, names passed from parent to child, rooted in land rather than legend. Their lives unfolded far from the grand courtyards of Knossos or Phaistos, in modest homes made of stone and wood, plastered with mud and white lime, roofed with reeds or clay tiles. Each home bore signs of life lived carefully: a cooking hearth blackened with years of fire, jars filled with dried herbs, walls carved with simple patterns that had once adorned palatial frescoes, but now echoed more in memory than in art. The rhythms of life were quieter now. A child was born, swaddled in woven cloth, laid near the warmth of a clay lamp. An old man passed, his life marked not by titles, but by the stories told in his absence. The people of this Crete no longer pursued expansion or spectacle. Their concerns were immediate: weather, harvest, health, kinship. Their joys were intimate: a good yield of grapes, the return of a son from a distant village, the calm of an evening breeze after a hot day. Though the wider Aegean world moved on, with Mycenae rising to dominance, and later new empires emerging, the islanders of Crete lived in a continuity that historians often overlook. They were not part of great battles or treaties, and their names were not etched into history by chroniclers. Yet they endured, and in their endurance, they preserved a thread of something deeply human. Occasionally, signs of contact with the outside world did return: a foreign bead found in a grave, perhaps a gift from a traveler, a bronze dagger made in a style not native to the island, traded for olives or linen. These moments were rare and likely held quiet fascination, but they did not redefine the culture. Crete was no longer a hub, it was a home, and homes do not need to conquer in order to matter. What remains of this final period is fragmented: broken pottery, faint outlines of buildings, buried seeds of once cultivated plants. But the absence of grandeur does not mean the absence of significance. These remnants tell us of resilience, of adaptation, of the quiet pride of a people who did not vanish in flames or war, but faded into the soil, leaving behind no last stand, no dramatic fall, just the soft echo of footsteps on stone paths slowly reclaimed by nature. When archaeologists study the layers of post-palatial Crete, they find no signs of mass destruction, no burn layers, or violent disruptions. The palaces had already been damaged long before, by earthquake, by fire, by internal decay. What followed was not erasure, but endurance. Villages were built near the ruins, not to resurrect old power, but to reuse old stones. Walls crumbled, but communities remained, and in the small acts of daily life, kneading dough, patching fishing nets, telling stories at dusk, the spirit of a civilization quietly persisted, even if no one called it by name. It's possible that a shepherd's granddaughter, born long after the last palace fell, may have sat on a stone once carved by artisans of Knossos. To her, it was just a seat, warmed by the sun. And yet in her veins flowed the same blood, her hands shaped the same clay, her eyes looked out at the same horizon. The story of the Minoans did not end with a final chapter. It drifted into the folds of daily life, passed on not by scribes, but by habit, instinct, and memory. And perhaps this is the deeper truth of history: not what is written, but what is lived. Today, tourists walk the reconstructed halls of Knossos, marveling at red columns and stylized frescoes. They imagine kings and rituals, dancers and gods. But beyond the painted stones lies another history, quieter, older, more enduring. A history not of palaces, but of people. A history not recorded, but remembered in the shape of a path, the scent of crushed oregano, the angle of a doorway that still catches morning light. The Minoans, as we name them, disappeared from the written record, but they did not disappear from life. Their presence lingers in the olive trees that still grow where ancient hands once tilled the soil, in the terraced hills shaped by generations of unseen labor, in the songs that drift through mountain air on warm nights. And as the modern world races forward, there is a strange comfort in this quiet past, a reminder that even the grandest civilizations, when stripped of their monuments and myths, are simply stories of people trying to live, to love, and to last. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with me. I hope this story brought you a little peace tonight. May your dreams be gentle, And when you wake in the morning, may you feel rested, lucky, and full of energy for the day ahead. Good night, and see you again soon.